Ladies and gentlemen, Christian is awesome. I'm really, really thrilled to have a chance to speak with him. I always enjoy when he comes to the net and everything he has to share. I appreciate his insight. I appreciate his on-the-ground work. I appreciate his attention to the details of what makes a community work, the legal frameworks that make a community work, the things that affect people's lives that they may not even realize affect their lives, that if you pay attention to can make a big difference. And I appreciate his desire to look into matters deeply because we do not exist in a world where everyone does that. So, Christian, what you thinking about? I'm glad you're here, and I just want to know what's on your mind, Christian. What's on your mind?
What you thinking about Willis, if you catch me? Um, so one thing I'm thinking about, well, you know that I'm working on this essay about consciousness, and the first half, the first 5,000 words of a 10,000 word essay are a very critical examination of current theories and debates and conflicts within consciousness studies. And I'm appealing quite a bit to Nikolai Hartmann's concept of aporias and apory. And well, there's a later thinker in the 1980s who kind of developed Hartmann's concept of apory. And so aporia, you might be familiar with from the Greek tradition. It's kind of can mean either an impasse, you've hit against an aporia, or it can describe a state of kind of like befuddlement, puzzlement. Like I don't know where to go from here. I'm puzzled. It can be used both ways. Hartmann uses it more in the sense of you've hit a theoretical impasse, and he basically posits that when you try to create a singular totalizing systemic view, which we were before we started recording, we're talking about in terms of like transcendental grounding. He says once you do that, you will run into what he calls artificial aporias. That means basically you are creating befuddlement for yourself. You are creating impasses for yourself once you commit yourself to a systemic view, basically. And he kind of develops that argument a bit and then ultimately says, and so we need to busy ourselves with the work of ontology, which is like, how do we just like talk about what's going on in a way that's pragmatic and useful? And then the second half of the paper is more an exploration of like, how can we talk about consciousness in a more useful way? And there I begin to appeal more to Charles Sanders Peirce,
Hmm.
who and his pragmatic theory of truth. And without getting into all of that, the thing I think is interesting to bring into community studies or relational studies is this, what happens when we're playing different language games, essentially, because a totalizing metaphysical system is a language game, right? Necessarily. And what I identify in consciousness studies is you have different people playing different language games, or some people who are playing two different language games but don't know how to bridge them. And then you're at the aporia of the hard problem of consciousness, for instance, or you do what Nikolai Hartmann calls an artificial synthesis. And that's where you kind of try to combine them into a singular thing, but in effect, you're just papering over the implicit aporias. He calls it the postulate of harmony. It's this you're trying to harmonize everything, but it's not doing the work of solving the aporias that are embedded in the different language games. So, for instance, if you say, yeah, like integrated information theory, for instance, it kind of starts with the primacy of consciousness and certain essential aspects of consciousness, and then tries to identify those aspects in the brain's processing. And then it does some interesting work there. And then it just says, well, and that is consciousness. You're like, wait a second. So what's primary here? Is it the consciousness like you first started, or is it now the brain? And they're like, no, they're the same thing. And you're like, but has that? Are you sure? Because there seems to be a difference between conscious experience and the brain. And so that's what Hartman would call a postulate of harmony or an artificial synthesis. You're just kind of like gluing things together, and it kind of covers over it occludes the problems that you were originally trying to address. Um, anyway, so I think in community settings, when we run into a disagreement, we don't do the work often of identifying the language games that we're playing. And I think that is a, one of the, if maybe not the most fundamental problem, but I would say one of the core problems. One of the core problems. So for instance, I'll talk like to invoke consciousness. There's like the whole realm of psi studies, psi phenomena, which are these like weird whatever, mind reading, etc. And there's a lot of like landmines you can step on because people want to totalize their language games and commit to some concept, for instance, that justifies their belief in a certain psi phenomena. And then if you say something which seems to undermine their transcendental grounding of that view, they will they feel threatened basically because now you're kind of challenging their worldview. And what doesn't happen is, oh, when you said that, what did you mean exactly? Let's find out if you're really challenging my worldview or not, or if we're just playing this linguistic association game where it's like that word kind of seems like that word, and so I'm conflating them, and you're attacking this thing, and I think you're attacking this thing. Or we're using the same words, but we're using them in different ways, and we haven't done the work of indexicality, which is what is your index for that word versus my index for that word. And then we jump the gun, and now we're in conflict, or we're offended, and we're exiting, or whatever, right? And we just don't do that basic thing, which I think at least the people that you and I will typically talk to around the net and whatnot. I think we're more sensitive to, or we're more aware of language games, and we're more likely to do that work. But often we don't do that work. So to me, that's an interesting idea, which is, if we want to see more and healthier community and social fabric, do we need basically for everyone to be more literate about language games? Do we need to does it need to become kind of second nature that we pause and say, what did you mean by that? Or this is what that means to me. And that's not something that's really part of the general population's whatever mode or as I just put it, literacy. So that's I think an interesting thing that I could say a lot about. But as I said before we started recording, I'm curious to know what Daniel's been thinking about. I'm thinking in terms of like experimental chemistry, experimental philosophical chemistry, because I like this kind of thing. I want to know what you've been thinking about lately, and then we might start to see how we can see some interesting overlap and intersection there. Maybe we won't, I don't know, but I feel like we certainly could. I think
Well, funny enough, it's like everything you're just saying. So I'm
oh,
thinking,
okay.
there we get it. I just have a different language. We just released this book called The Map is Indestructible. And the key idea of that book is the problem of internally consistent systems, which is the main, I would say, kind of area, arena, zone, maybe premise of that has been kind of central to my, I want to say, epistemology, like this problem. And the entire distinction of the true isn't the rational, all of the books, the conflict of mind, the map is indestructible, and reconstructing A as A are basically centered on this massive problem called the problem of internally consistent systems that really came out in 2012, 13, 14. I'd have talks with Ken and Grant about it, Lorenzo, something we talked about a lot from studying a lot of religious apologetics, Austrian economics, communism, as many ideologies as possible, Islam, Hinduism, etc., so forth, and going through all of these different worldviews, and also looking at various conspiracies in history, various interpretations of wars, all of these different accounts in different books. And the thing that became increasingly clear is that, of course, so I'm going to make a distinction here between account, notion, and map. By map, I mean an internally consistent system. Okay, I don't just mean like a way of understanding. I have a very specific understanding of what a map is. It has to be internally consistent. So basically, when you go through, you see that not every single account is true. There have been millions of accounts, thousands, whatever, that are false, right? That they are what I would just call mere notions. But the issue is that there are hundreds, not thousands, maybe thousands, I don't know, but there's clearly hundreds, and certainly 40 on the world stage that have major influence. But in the world, there are lots and lots of maps, which are internally consistent systems. And what they are systems of which could be true. They could be true. There is no reason, you cannot make the move of saying they're false. They may not be true, but they're coherent. And here's the issue. You have to make trade-offs between coherence and correspondence. Just because you can't prove that something corresponds with reality, it actually does not mean it's false. Because it could simply be that you don't have access to what you need to make it correspond. Or maybe you believe in God. Well, you can't access God. But does that mean it's there, your religion is therefore false? No. If God exists, God is that of which cannot be directly accessed in a manner that creates certainty, right? So basically, when you go through and like, let's take a free market economics. Many Austrian people that really want to stress that markets should be left alone by government, if you point out 2008, they'll say, well, that's because it's a mixed market, not a free market. The government got involved. They were supporting mortgages, and that's why the system failed. And a lot of them may argue now, and I hear this all the time from more Austrian economists, is they will say that the reason we have the wealth gap, the reason asset houses are so costly and no one can buy anything is basically because we did not allow the banks to fail in 2008. Had that been allowed to occur, it would have been incredibly painful. It would have lasted for 5 or so years, but you would have then had a much healthier economy. But there's no way to prove that, right? Now, the Keynesians come along and say, no, 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 no. If you didn't bail out the banks, because Keynesians are distinct from Austrians, the Keynesian comes along and says, you don't actually understand how severe the 2008 crisis was. Had you let the banks go under, it would have been a global depression, the likes of which you cannot imagine, right? And if you look at the data, the case is internally consistent. If you look at Austrian economics, the case is internally consistent. Let's look at communism. The argument is always the following. Communism has never been done. It gets usurped by Stalinism. The power does not give up the class to go to the people. And if you look at the Marxist doctrine, it's internally consistent. And it's absolutely true that it has never been done in the way that the theory says it needs to be done to work. So it's internally consistent. We have an issue. That's for internally consistent systems. Now choose your government, choose your economy, choose how you're going to do things. Well, everyone, according to their internally consistent system, who, here's the key, are rationally responsible. They are not ideological. They're looking at the data. They're looking at the evidence. They look at the evidence and communism's never been done. They look at the evidence and Keynesian's true. They look at the evidence and Austrian economics was never done. They're not ideologue. They're reasonable. They're looking at the evidence, right? And it's internally consistent because rationality cannot get you out of an internally consistent system. This is why autonomous rationality is problematic. It cannot get you out of it. All rationality can do is confirm coherence. It cannot confirm correspondence because the world has to give you correspondence. The world has to not bail out the banks and then you see what happens. The world has to bail out the banks and then you see what happens. The world has to try Marxism, not Stalinism, and see what happens. You cannot do that. The world has to do it. It has to practically be done. Oh, and then if it doesn't work, you could always say, well, it didn't work because people didn't do what they were supposed to. It would have worked if people just did what was right, if they would have bailed out the banks sooner, if they wouldn't have bailed out the banks, if the Fed would have lowered interest rates. You can always come up with a plausible reason why it didn't work even if it was tried. So this is the double mood. Rationality can't take a step, only the world can do it. The world has to try the thing, and then you see what occurs. Oh, but then whatever tries, you will always find a way to say that it wasn't tried properly, that it wasn't done entirely correct. And those will be two rationally justified moves. Those will be completely rationally justified. You're right.
Sure.
They didn't do it correctly. So we're trapped. We're trapped.
Yeah.
And basically, the entire trilogy of the Truism of the Rational is trying to paint the epistemological situation we are in that I don't think is appreciated. I think basically we have the rationalist community that wants to stress rationalism, mental models, and I'm quite like a lot of these books came out of taking all of that incredibly seriously. Mental models, like really looking into logic and all of that, and basically going, rationalism itself is an internally consistent system. Because if people follow the rationalist model and the premises and the fundamental axioms, it's internally consistent and will work. Here's the other key. All internally consistent systems work. They work. So
Sure.
under what reason would you discount X internally consistent system versus Y? And I'll say map interchangeably. X map, Y map, Z map, they all work for the people that ascribe to them. Works great. So where's your evidence that it shouldn't be done? It's very pragmatic. Right. You just have to extend your definition of pragmatism. A lot of Christians, let's look at many Christians today. A lot of people say Christianity is impractical. Well, they're looking at the world. They say, well, y'all don't have community. Y'all are not able to create, community is pretty practical. Social resources are practical. The ability to go next door and have a neighbor that kind of shares in your worldview, that's practical, because when you need to take care of stuff in the community, if everyone thinks like you, that's pretty practical, beneficial. We've restricted the definition of pragmatism to individually pragmatic, right? And that is going to lead to a map of pragmatism or neo-pragmatism following Richard Rorty, which also critically, a lot of the truisms of the rational emerged out of taking all of that incredibly seriously. Richard, after looking at existentialism, postmodernism, I was like, well, I guess the last one standing are Richard Rorty and the neo-pragmatists and the great, C.S. Peirce is unbelievable. He's just like insane. And he's also more complex than Richard Rorty. He kind of deserves his own department or something. But anyway, Richard Rorty, you look at this and you go, well, pragmatism itself is an internally consistent system relative to its own end. Someone else says, I don't agree with your premises. What do you do? What do you do?
Yeah.
So, to me, when you're describing, so first off, what you were describing with the language grain problem, I call the meta language skill, the ability to have a language about languages and to move between the meta language. That is absolutely necessary in a world of maps. And before I forget, just to lay the groundwork some more, basically, I believe we are in the age of maps. I think we have gone through a historic process where for a lot of history, we were dealing with notions. And we had to go through thousands of years of realizing rationality, pragmatism, and all of these mental models and tools to get rid of all the notions. And it was a very important effort, just like the Enlightenment was incredibly important to help us move out of fanaticism. But here's the problem. Now we're in the historic age where that effort of thinking has been exhausted. It can't get us any further. It can't deal with the problem of maps. It can deal with the problem of notions and falsities, if you will, but it can't deal with the problems of maps. And we're overfitting the model. We're overfitting the tool now. You need the tool of, because very often, as you know, I'll talk about the problems of autonomous rationality, right? It is very critical, though, for people to understand. When I say that, I am not saying that rationality did not historically have an incredibly important function to get us to where we are now. The problem is because it worked so well, it would be reasonable to assume that you should keep using it, right? When that is simply going to lead to, well, nihilism, deconstruction, and basically the logic of AI, basically, is what you're going to have. Which, again, is not necessarily a bad thing if we rise to the occasion and meet it, but that's the contingency that is up to us. Now we need something like non-rationality with the non in parentheses, because let me also clarify, Before the Enlightenment, you could say the world was under the tyranny of autonomous non-rationality, which gave you religious wars, it gave you fanaticism, and then you had the scientific revolution, and then we fell into the problem of autonomous rationality. And now we are in the age of having to think them both. But here's the problem. If you think them both, everything gets crazy. Because how do you think those two things together and do it well, right?
Right.
That to me is the very live problem, and that the truism of the rational comes out of, blah, blah, blah. But to what you were saying, if you take all this seriously in the problem of community, so there's, we can actually solve the problem of community quite quickly. Go find someone who shares your map and don't talk with anyone else but those people. Great, you're done, right? Well, that's what people are doing. And basically, here's the problem. We are in the age of maps. And one of the ways, so right now everyone talks about the meaning crisis, which has validity. I have no trouble with that concept in Vervaeke, blah, blah, blah. It is simply, I think you just have to make distinctions between meaning, belonging. You also have to identify that the meaning crisis is more of a college-educated white-collar phenomenon. Most blue-collar people, they still believe in God. They still go to church. 95% of people still identify as Christian, right? They don't think the universe is meaningless, right? It's just a lot of people that has gone through a certain educational program. Also,
Right.
I would also say quite very important. I think a whole lot of the meaning crisis, quote unquote, and nihilism is due to economic problems. Like people feel like, what's the point? Because I can't get ahead, I can't buy anything, so life is
Yes.
meaningless. Like it's really important not to, and I'm not saying Vervaeke makes this mistake. I'm not saying that. I don't know. What I am saying is that it is a mistake to think meaninglessness is only a reflection of, say, belief in God or not. Meaninglessness absolutely is tied also to socioeconomic pressures and problems, right? So those have to be taken seriously. But the point is this. We actually do know how to give meaning. So when we talk about the meaning crisis, no, we know how to give meaning. Xenophobia, racism, fascism, isolated community, tribalism, anyone can give meaning at any point. The people who are suffering a meaning crisis are those who believe those ways are immoral. Like that would be a regression, right? But you see, but that's an important point, because if people are feeling meaninglessness, that means they can just go to these things like fascism, and that's happening. That's happening. People are absolutely withdrawing from globalism and diversity, and they're going more in the direction of isolated communities. Now, that's not inherently necessarily bad, but here's the problem. Basically, I think history is a story of swinging between centralization and decentralization. Like you have, right now the magic word is decentralization. If we just decentralize, everything will be well. Well, yeah, people have done that. Balkanization, civil war, confederacy, etc., so forth. That works great until you have an ethical disagreement. The ethical disagreement is when everything goes to crap. I like to call that the ethical real, kind of playing on Lacan. Like decentralization is great until those people over there are doing something that you think is demonic. And then you believe in, difference now? You believe, oh, do you? Really?
Yeah.
So, and then you centralize, it just swings forever back and forth, right? And that's where we are. In an age of maps, basically the form of community, and I think this is all relevant to community, and I'll throw it back to you in a minute, because I just think all of this is getting at basically our moment. That's really critical. In an age of maps, you should expect the return of small fascist states. That is what you will see, because a map is a small fascist state. And a fascist state, the problem is it's hard for people to know what fascism is anymore, because they hear that word and they think Nazism, right? And they go immediately there. Well, fascism as a political philosophy is basically you'll probably have state capitalism, not free market. It'll probably be state capitalism, and the unifying principle of the people will be something non-rational, like skin color or nationality or soil or belief. It will be a single that leads to a certain harmony of people who agree to that non-rational premise. Or the map. We'll just say map, right? And you'll have Christianity here, you'll have communism here, you'll have Islam, etc., so forth, right? And people will isolate into their maps, right? And you could say, what's wrong with that, right? You can say, hey, everyone just isolates? That's great, right? Well, here's the issue with that. We've never seen in history that occur and not get war. And also, natural resources are not evenly distributed. And this is always the real of economics. So you say, okay, China, screw you. We're going to be our own map, our own global, political state. You do whatever. You do you. We don't care. Yeah, China has five, quite a number of rare earth minerals that no one else has, right? So you
Yeah.
say, forget you, China. And they're like, fine, we'll keep all our lithium or whatever. Well, without lithium, you don't have the internet. And you have a problem in the Middle East. Fine, y'all can use natural gas if you want. Good luck. No, just use nuclear. Oh, you're 10 years away from getting nuclear. Oh, I guess you need petroleum then. Oh, crap. So what always happens and what kind of backfires on decentralized efforts is the fact that limit natural resources are not evenly distributed.
Sure.
And other nations have things that other, and then, but here's what ends up happening. Here's my point. So when people find a small fascist state, and I assume YouTube won't automatically take this down because I've said small fascist state. I hope we can, we'll see. The problem is people when they find people who share a map, they genuinely find belonging. They do. They feel like they belong. We all share, and it's nice that your neighbor has the same views as you. It all just flows, and it's coherent, and it's wonderful. So a big argument of belonging, again, is that we find a different way to get belonging, because people are going to get belonging, and they're either going to get it in small fascist states, or they're going to figure out how to get it in global pluralism. So we better figure out how to do that. But if they're going to get it in global pluralism, we have to think a lot of the stuff you're thinking, which is hard. So anyway, people are going to find belonging. It's going to be great. They're going to find community. And this is the issue. The muscle of being able to handle difference will atrophy. The ability to deal with
Yes.
people that think different than will get weak. And then one day you will bump into another small fascist state and you'll be like, hey, what's going on, guys? No problem, blah, blah, blah. And then a serious disagreement will arise, or a trade issue will arise, or some natural disaster will occur that will force you to interact with the other. And your
Yeah.
muscle for dealing with otherness has atrophied. So the likelihood of that going well is very low. And once it goes bad, what begins to occur? Us versus them. Others, we're saved, they're not. And then once you do that, it's only a matter of time before, well, death.
Yeah.
And so that's our current trajectory if we do not think the problem of internally consistent systems, if we do not think the problem of maps, which ultimately is to think the problem of communities and to think the metaxis, to use Desmond's terms, the between space where communities bump up against one another. But the skill set, so I'm going to pause and give it to you, but there's a million more things to say.
Sure.
The skill set of interacting maps is radically different than the skill set of a map. We are quite good at the skill set of a map. We have thousands of books of apologetics. We have lots of mental models. We've got epistemology. We've got education. We've got logic. We are real freaking good at maps and internal consistency. What we are not good at all is between spaces, between
Yeah.
where difference interacts. And that's where you start having to talk meta skills, almost by definition, because meta is a thinking that is not map bound. It is trying to think between internally consistent systems, which, by the way, almost seems impossible because you have to think the between space within a map. Then are you actually thinking the between space or only the between space in terms of your map that is not between? So are you just
Right.
fooling yourself? Maybe you're just fooling yourself. How do you know? How do you not know? These are the stakes. And if we cannot think this, if we cannot deal with this,
Yeah.
I think we're in huge trouble. So I'll pause.
Yeah. There's I'll throw out a few things. One, I mean, I think this highlights why the term liminal web exists. I think a lot of people who find themselves in the quote liminal web are people who they're people without a single map, basically,
Mhm.
and they recognize a lot of maps, or they have maybe a couple maps or one map, but they see the problem of the inability to integrate those maps with other maps, whatever. And then in that liminal space, different things are happening. One, you see kind of authority figures rising up, who often are proposing uh, a kind of map of all maps. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. That could be helpful, except that it's blind to its own
Yeah.
mapness a lot of
Hmm.
times.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and then you have competition among meta maps. Like there was, a fight that an argument between certain parties a couple of years ago between the idea of oh, how did they frame it? It was like uh, system maps, ontologies, blah blah blah, versus something more like pure relationality, blah blah blah, and they couldn't agree with each other. It's like waves versus particles. It's like pick your side type of a thing. Um, and so I see often that we end up in dead ends there. And we run into a lot of the problems that Hartman identifies.
Yes.
We create a presumed harmony of maps that is artificial and
Yes.
creates its own problems. Um, and one thing I just wanted to mention as an aside is that I live out here in rural Arizona, part of multiple communities that don't necessarily have complete boundaries, but in some cases have some boundaries. But also, of course, a lot of the individuals in this community, and then, of course, a lot of people who are not in any given. When I say community, I mean the general off-grid homesteader rural lifestyle community that exists out here, which we have in common a few things. Often we're using opt-out permits to build non-traditional homes, interests in holistic lifestyle, obviously interest in rural lifestyle. Um, and another thing that's quite common is that people out here, this kind of can feel like a liminal safe zone, or like you're outside of the chaos of the problem of the maps, right? A lot of people are kind of seeking like political refuge from the just the craziness of the world right now. But you get a new type of map oftentimes, which is this isolationist. If I can just figure out how to grow my own food and get solar panels and all this thing, well, like I have my own little world, my own fascist mini state. I'm not going to use the word fascism here just because I don't want to call people fascists,
Sure.
but I understand your meaning by it.
Yeah.
It's master of your own little
Yeah.
domain, your property, and I once in a while like, and some people think that this is something that will be survivable in case of some type of conflict, or when shit hits the fan, as they say. Well, I've got my stuff, I'm off grid, blah blah blah. And I sometimes carefully will bring up the point of natural resources and be like, all right, you need water, you need a well, you need electricity, you need solar panels, you need to repair your solar panels, you need, how are you going to take care of that? Also, if shit really does hit the fan, people with guns, whether that's a rogue sheriff's department that forms a union, or the cartel, we're right on the border of Mexico, or whoever, just some neighbors, and they need resources, guess what? They're going to come take your resources. Or they're like, ooh, that guy's got a lot of solar panels. We need those solar panels. We're going to
Yeah.
go grab those solar panels.
Yeah.
Or they have a nice big greenhouse. Great. We're going to
Yeah.
commandeer that
Totally.
greenhouse. So yeah, we run into that problem here, except and then there's another thing that I see, which is and more of the new agey mindset, which is like natural resource scarcity. You're suffering from a scarcity mindset, and you need to adopt an abundance mindset. It's like, all right, I'm pretty sure that my abundance mindset will not make the groundwater levels stop declining. I don't know. And it's just like, well, and it's, my dad, when I was talking with him about groundwater stuff the other day, and he's not here, so he's not very familiar with the issue, but he didn't like hold this as a firm like grounding, but he he appealed to some verse in the Bible, which was maybe I don't remember, but it might have been the one like we provide for the birds. God will provide for the birds, so of course He'll provide for you. As if that's like doesn't as if that negates the reality of resource scarcity.
Right.
Which I don't think that was probably the point of that scripture.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, so we whether it's like abundance mindset or off-grid isolationism or finding an ideological group that's going to fix the problems or win the conflict, and you just put all your money on your group winning, and then that'll solve the problem. We keep running into these issues. The last thing I'll put out before I throw it back to you is, you know, this isn't necessarily a question so much for, I mean, it can be, but it's not as much a question for like a small scale real life community. Well, it depends on the size, it depends on the people. So let's say it can be, but it's not always. But when we get back to, as you put it, the kind of ethical assumptions, the kind of transcendental ethics that we carry, these are axioms a lot of times. They're like fundamental axiologies. I just think that that's wrong, and then I build on top of that. Um, this is where I think I don't have his name. Nikolai Hartman appeals to this thinker. It's Von something. I'll bring it up and so I can reference it well. But um, it is the idea. It's kind of an emotivist framework of ethics. If you're familiar with emotivism,
Hmm.
okay. So it's basically saying our claims to what is good is in some sense, if not completely, grounded in feeling or at least something pre-rational. Um, and so it's not like ethical realism where some action or whatever has an essential character of being good or bad. No, 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 no. The goodness and the badness is created in our relationship to whatever, and we can understand it within ourselves as a feeling. Um, I think this is really helpful but difficult, and I think if there's a revolution that needs to happen, it's this. Um, it's that we have to understand our ethics as not in terms of like pure subjectivism, which is like, well, it's true for me, so in some sense it's absolutely true. That's not the claim, but rather that when I say something is good, the truth of my claim is in that it correlates to something inside of me, a feeling, a whatever, often mixed up with, of course, our beliefs, and our cognition and our rationality, but necessarily including feeling or sense. And so that's why I say all the time in our net chats, the sense of beauty, truth, and goodness. And this is something I get into a little bit in my essay, but I think in some sense, you could say we need better emotional intelligence. And I think a big part of how we're going to get better emotional intelligence is, first of all, looking at ethics through this lens of sense, and then developing a developing our sensitivity essentially in terms of our ethics, which is to say, we find greater shades of goodness, not necessarily in a scale of good to bad, but like different flavors of goodness, right? So like an easy example would be the idea of like a bitter sweetness, right? it's kind of bitter, but it's also kind of sweet, right? And that's like, a complex, nuanced, emotional register, right? Where that seems to have both. You could use a metaphor of actual taste, which like we do often with in terms of bittersweet. When I'm a kid, I taste some guacamole. There's some flavors that are really harsh, and I'm like, I can't. Or like you see a video of giving a baby some lemon, it's just like overloads one, right? Or something kind of would taste good, but we don't really have the palate for the spiciness or something like this. Spicy, maybe not a great metaphor, but anyways, we can learn to get a taste for beer. Whereas first it tastes like water filled with pennies, like and then after time we start to like appreciate these otherwise difficult flavors, you might say. Um, and I think that we in order to kind of bridge all these ethical divides and gaps that we have, in order to help link up our maps, so to speak, at this very fundamental level, which is I think where it needs to happen the most.
Yes.
Not at not at the level of superficial belief. I think like if you link it down low at the core of ethics and epistemology and all of that, then downstream our maps will naturally start to synthesize in ways that are helpful, or at least we'll be able to translate between maps more fluidly. But the real work needs to be done at a more fundamental level. And so I think this is where it's helpful to look at Eastern phenomenology, which in I don't know, I can't say it's in most cases, but at least in a lot of cases, whether it's Buddhism or Samkhya or Taoism, these projects are not their aim is not to create a transcendental ground of
Mhm.
reality. It's just not. It's like the Samkhya, what's it trying to do? It's trying to address the three afflictions. Buddhism, it's trying to address afflictions. It's trying to liberate you. It's trying to eliminate suffering, right? That is the teleology of the Eastern metaphysics and phenomenology in a lot of cases. And I think we have to do that, find a way to do that in, quote unquote, the West, or just the global situation that we find ourselves in, but particularly in the West. So that means that so I'll appeal to a concept that you'll find in a lot of Eastern metaphysics, which is that so like in Samkhya, for instance, you're starting with this metaphysical picture that there's the witness, and then there's pure energy potentiality, and then everything kind of arises in their confluence. And you might posit that that is a third thing, that their interaction. In some cases, like tantric Shaivism, that it is a third thing, and you have fundamental trilogies, etc. And anyways, the idea is that you build a strong concept, a map that accounts for all of this for the purposes of not identifying with it.
Yes.
And then it's posited that as that identification ceases and you get more into the kind of core of who you are, this ineffable witness, whatever, you then have access, you're free from suffering. And it's often posited that that is the core of bliss and love and joy and all these positive affects, right? Um, so I would say a kind of bridging of the project of what we see in the East with Western projects of metaphysics and phenomenology, neurophenomenology, and ontologies, and also psychology and therapy, is that so typically you're in the mode of personal narrative, right? Like typically your therapist isn't inviting you to discover non-duality or pure witness or something like that. It's just like, let's like work within the framework of your personal story and all of this, and try to smooth out some of those wrinkles and loosen some of those knots. And it might work, it might not. um, and you can get a lot of kind of fine graded, especially in psychiatry. Once you get into the science of it, you get this plethora of theory about how the mind works and how personalities work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would say if we were to kind of take those two projects and bring them together, what we are doing is creating a project of emotional maturity, where in emotional maturity allows you to sense goodness where it might otherwise be hard to sense. All right. And that's again because like you're developing a taste for it or a sense of it, which can be hard to do. It takes work, right? Or it takes exposure to, like, if some people like white bread and to them wheat bread tastes yucky. Other people learn to appreciate the kind of earthy, minerally flavor of the grains and blah, blah, blah. So I'd say the project of emotional maturity, one, depends on being in touch with the source of your emotions, which I would say the Eastern phenomenology generally has right. This might be a fundamental claim, but I believe that goodness and the sense of goodness and love and beauty and all these things really come from this deep, kind of ineffable, great self that we might all share, which some people might call God, if you'd like. Um, but so your ability to identify more with that transcendent aspect of self and less with the material aspect of self gives you, first of all, just greater access to the, let's say, like light, to use a metaphor, pure bright light. And then first of all, now color is more vivid in our metaphor here. We see color being a metaphor for emotional maturity. Like we have it's just brighter, but then we need to get more fine grained in our colors. And that's where I think the Western project of, like, really finely dividing things up and then focusing on them and then building a relationship to them is what integration, basically. It's in some sense it's the problem of, how do I take that wonderful enlightenment I feel on my meditation retreat and bring that into my daily life and traffic jams and shitty coworkers and all of that thing, right? So you need to have like access to the non-dual, to put it in maybe a kind of neutral way. And then you have to allow that light to shine on the complexity of the world and start to build a sensitivity to how you find goodness here and there and there and there and there and there and there, such that you can notice the bittersweetness of office drama. Be like, yeah, this kind of sucks, but also, isn't that what life is? I'm not going to be, I'm not going to close down energetically. I'm not going to take a fearful stance and then become avoidant or confrontational unnecessarily, or not as quickly as I might otherwise. Right? I can kind of feel supported by my access to that non-dual, transcendent goodness and love, and then I have to do the work of, like, all right, just keep letting it shine on this situation until I can understand it a little bit better. I'd say in some sense, and I'll stop here. I said I was going to stop a long time ago, but I got on a rant. I'll stop here. When we can kind of, let's say, shine the light of beauty, truth, and goodness on any given situation, that affords us the opportunity to try to understand it better, because we remain open. We remain kind of like in a sense of integrity. We've not succumbed to fight, flight, fawn, freeze reactions, right? which don't lend themselves to learning. So, anyways, that I'd say it's and those are that's a kind of a different project than the like translational meta language game, but I think that they work together
Yes.
in an important way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Outstanding. All right. Very, very well said and very important. All right. So first, on what you were saying about the people with the greenhouses, drones, people going, taking them, et cetera, so forth. It cannot be overstated how much society is a logistical miracle. It is a miracle of logistical coordination. When people talk about off the grid, I'm not always sure if they understand. Basically, that is impossible because even if you did do it, the people with the drones are coming. What are you going to do? You're going to have anti-drone weaponry to take them off, unless you have
They'll
tanks.
bring the grid to you.
Yeah, that's right. So there is no off the grid. Unless you are going to be truly, there's perhaps one way to do it. You would have to be Amish, very seriously Amish. And the caveat to the Amish is this: you are okay with being killed when they invade. Because the Amish are pacifists. And this goes to a
Mm.
Koratani point. Koratani, who's comparing the capital nation state, he's a kind of a Japanese thinker, Marxist tradition, et cetera, so forth. But when he points out, he wants to ask the difference between Athens and Iona, because he believes Iona is actually the birthplace of much of the great philosophy, the pre-Socratics, and
Mm.
that Iona democracy has been an unthought political structure compared to Athens, right? Now, he has a wonderful book on Iona. I think Karatani is a very important thinker. He wrote a very important, he writes very important books. But the key to Iona, it was basically a form of anarchism that maintained a social order. It wasn't just chaos. And it even had, you could say, economic and social advancement. And you could say it was a thriving civilization. But there's a catch. There's no central power. Okay. No central power at all. So it's kind of you could say a kind of free market, almost you could say free market, kind of just a kind of individual paradise. And it seemed to have worked very well. But here's the catch. When they were invaded, they were destroyed because they had no standing army. Here's always the problem. The only way you can avoid central power at the end of the day is if you don't have a standing army. If you have a standing army, then you require a central power. Also, if you have international trade, and this is something Kanye in The Great Transformation stressed. He's like, there's no such thing as free markets unless they are regional and isolated. Because the moment you're trading with another country, you have to have trade agreements, and those are always done by governments, and you have to have a navy to defend the trade. So he's basically like, there's no such thing as free markets and global trade. And he also gets into an argument about the gold standard and things like that. But the point is this: the only way that you could possibly be maybe off the grid is if you are a pacifist. But that means you have to be okay with being annihilated when the people show up with the weapons and the drones. And yeah, that Iona, and you could argue in the claim I would like to make, and some people have made this, is that the whole idea of the Second Amendment in America was the possibility of not having a standing army. Therefore, you'd have a free society. You'd have a
Mm.
militia. People would have guns, and if you needed to come together to fight the enemy, they could, but there would not be a standing army. There would just be the
Mm.
people with guns that would come together, and that would dramatically remove the need for central power. And you could say that, and you could say that was all well and good until military technology advanced so dramatically that you can't have
Right.
the average person with a cruise missile or something, right? But it is very interesting. Basically,
Mm.
today when people talk about off the grid, it's not possible. Unless you are fine with being annihilated, which of course people may say they are, but when you're truly living in the anxiety of those late nights knowing that they're coming and there's nothing you can do and you're with your family, you may say that now, but when you get to the reality of it, you will not be okay. It will be a nightmare. The reason why I stress this is because if you take this seriously, then we have to figure this problem out, basically. Like, if it fails, if society fails, if the global order fails, if global pluralism fails, the consequences are truly dire.
Mm.
Um, but I think a lot of people have fantasies about off the grid or isolated community or making our own way that kind of blunts the true horror of what would occur if all of these things failed. Now, you also said, so there's many things because first off, at the beginning, you were talking about, different forms of maps, meta maps, integral maps, systems mapping. Basically, the argument of, you could say the truism of the rational is to say all forms of map making are insufficient. Like, it doesn't matter. It could be a better map. It could be a worse map. There are better maps. There are worse maps. I am not saying all maps are equal. But if you take the question is the following. What is the main problem? Is the main problem the quality of your map, or is the problem global pluralism?
Right.
If the problem is global pluralism, then better maps are not an address. It may be better, but it will not actually deal with the problem of handling difference or the encounter with difference. But I do stress there are better maps. There are better, there are many theologies of Christianity, and I think there are better theologies of Christianity. I think the Roman road theology is very problematic. I think something like the King Victus theology that an N.T. Wright stresses is far better, or based on the E.P. Sanders works of the 70s that really wants to stress Judaism in Paul's thinking, right? There are better maps, and it is better for people to have better maps than worse. But at the end of the day, if you are talking about the issue of global pluralism, which has to apply to no one in particular, meaning anyone of any possible map, whatever they may choose, Roman road, King Victus, communism, capital, doesn't matter. The address must apply to them. If not, then your supposed address is basically conversion. You must convert people. You must. Well, if you have to convert people, the game's over, because now we're talking violence. And you can say, no, education. Now we're talking indoctrination. And you say, no, it's not indoctrination, because our map is the truth. Ah, there you go. Our map is the truth. But what did we say about the problem of internally consistent systems? All maps have equal probability of being right or wrong relative to their own consistency, which is all anybody has. So if you make the move of simply saying, well, they're just wrong, yeah, there's going to be a revolution. Eventually, people will stand up and you'll have a civil war. This strategy will not work. The strategy of moving people to better maps that genuinely may be better, that is not sufficient. So our relation to maps in of themselves has to change. Not simply better maps, but what we are doing when we think has to change, actually. Because a giant claim I would like to make is that in a very real way, I would almost say we haven't even started thinking, which sounds odd, because what I mean by that is that thinking has basically been in service of creating internal consistency. It has not been in the business of the between spaces, which in that sense, thinking has simply been following the trajectory. It hasn't been its own process. It has been filling out maps, not apathetic. It has not been thinking the live in the concrete. In a way, all we've been doing is map making, but I would kind of argue that in a sense that has never been the fullness of thinking. We really have not engaged in the fullness of thinking because all we have used thinking for is consistency, internal consistency of maps. And for that reason, I would want to stress using thought not to simply make better maps, but to change our relation to maps entirely. Now, what does that mean? A few more things. You mentioned the East versus the West. It is not by chance.
That's a map.
Yeah, that's a map. There you go. Now, here's the other thing. If the name of the game is to erase maps, you lose. You can't erase maps. Humans require maps to function. Well, then we're doomed, right? Because aren't we stuck in maps? Well, actually, if we don't have to erase maps, there actually might be more hope because everyone's already a map. What we have to do is identify a potential that every possible map contains to every possible person that holds them in relation to the map they have. Let me say that again. What has to be identified is a possibility latent in every possible map. Because if every possible map entails a latent potential, then every possible person could theoretically realize that potential that would create a universal between all maps without sacrificing maps, without changing anyone. I call this the Gödel point. Now, I will elaborate on that.
Now I know what that means. Okay.
Yes. The Gödel point is the point that every possible map must contain that does not require anyone to leave their map, and yet in being latent in all possible maps, there is the possibility of a universal relationality that everyone can share in their difference, in their map, right? Now, I'm going to put that on hold for just a moment, but this is key. So I don't think it's by chance that many people in the West are becoming more apathetic in their Christianity. You can see this, the move of East Orthodox in Christianity, that has always been apathetic. The move of mysticism, rather it be in psychedelics or religion, you are seeing this move in the West to something apathetic. I would argue that the East has always been more apathetic. It's been apathetic in different ways. You could talk of the Kyoto school. You could do Nidjianti no-thingness that Quinn is so good at. There is always, and you could also say that in Hinduism, the emphasis on Om and the manifestation, it's not, they call it polytheism in Hinduism, but it's actually a monotheism that has multiple manifestations, which is dealing with it's how Hinduism has come up with ways to deal with the problem of the one and the many. Now, what did Western metaphysics give us? I actually am quite sympathetic to Heidegger. Heidegger says that Western metaphysics gave us technology, that the logic of Western metaphysics is how we got technology. Now, he warns that that's leading to standing reserve, alienation, nihilism, bad nihilism, etc., and so forth. Now, before we all sit around and say, well, that was a mistake, let us go back to our first point on the logistic miracle of society. People may not understand how hard life was without technology, because technology is not merely computers. We're talking medical care, we're talking cars, we're talking the very things that's allowing us to speak, we're talking refrigeration, air conditioning, and so on and so forth. A world without technology is very, very difficult. It is very hard. It is beneficial in other ways, but it is also very difficult in others. If one wants to make the argument that we would have been better off without technology, that time has passed, and you do have to ask, why is it that so many people were easily converted to a more technological society who had the choice at the time, right? They probably had pretty good experience of the alternative, and we have seen throughout history, people have gradually moved in the direction of more technology. Is that because they're brainwashed? Maybe, but we have seen that collectively people have moved toward technology. So to say that Western metaphysics was a mistake, I think is a mistake. But if you want to argue it is now overfitting, I completely agree. We are at the age where now to continue the trajectory of an autonomous Western metaphysics, if you will, is a mistake. Heidegger, I do think, realized this. This is why at the end of his life, he's going to Japan. He's looking at the Kyoto school. He's looking at no-thingness. He's going into poetry. He is looking into moving into clearing, letting, all very apathetic thinking. I do basically think Heidegger is the story of philosophy in a single life, if you look at his trajectory. But also the tragedy of that, because he ends up in Nazism, right? Well, his life is basically us as a global order, as a collective consciousness. That's where we're freaking going unless we can figure out the transition. How do we figure out the transition, though? So it is not by chance. Look, Dietrich McCloskey, many economists point out that the Great Enrichment that began in the 1617 to the 1820s started in the Dutch Empire. The explosion, the average person on planet Earth goes from less than $1 to the day, and it just skyrockets thousands of percent. Her wonderful trilogy, The Bourgeoisie, many sociologists talk about this mysterious Great Enrichment that occurred, right? It is hard to argue that this Great Enrichment was not primarily an explosion of technological well-being. And it happens more, until then, the leader of technology in the world was basically China. Paper, gunpowder, et cetera, so forth. The four, I think they call it the four great inventions or something, maybe six, et cetera, so forth. So here's the funny thing. You could make an argument that if you introduce more apathetic thinking too early, that it actually removes the incentive to engage in technological enrichment, right? But then if you never introduce it, you get your own set of problems, right? And now we're on the trajectory to Nick Land, technological singularity that removes the human, right? So there is this sort of issue now of thinking the bothness, right? But how do you think the bothness of Eastern and Western metaphysics without that just being a cute meta map, right? How does it become something concrete? Because now you say, oh, so just let's just combine them, right? Well, how do you not get a, you know, problematic aporia, a fake synthesis, as you were saying at the beginning? Also, I really like the artificial aphoria notion, aporia, because basically I think most people, in a sense, waste their thinking on the artificial aporias that emerge in maps. And they just spend a lot of time on those that emerge in internal consistency, overcome them for the sake of consistency, believing that, great, this is a great accomplishment of thought. I do think basically the history of accomplishments in thought have mostly simply been in the service of map making. But here's another key. Does that mean that map making was a mistake? Well, no, 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 no. What did you say? And this is actually getting exactly at it. The point in the East of making a really good map is to precisely not identify with it, right? So it would be a mistake to say that all of these centuries of thought being in the business of making maps was a mistake. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if we keep doing that, then we will face very great consequence because now you're overfitting it. And in a funny way, I'm trying, when I say this provocative idea that thinking has not begun, I mean to say that there's a lot to look forward to. And also the sense of, oh, if this was thinking simply in the business of correspondence, what might thinking be possible if it were actually to be able to handle the between space? And I would also make a very strong argument that the great enrichment was precisely thought in a between space, that great social enrichments and creative possibilities, Randall Collins' sociological theory of intellectual term. When you look at history, it is these spaces of people meeting between maps, rather at Bloomsbury or the Apostles or whatever, that are the explosion of possibility. That, to me, are the examples of thought at its finest that we haven't owned. And thus we have predominantly identified thought in a lesser way. That for me to say that thinking can begin now is to actually own these pockets of thought. Because here's, I think, a major mistake we've made. When we look at the Bloomsbury group, for example, Virginia Woolf, Keynes, Bertrand Russell, et cetera, so forth, we say, oh, that's where all the all-stars gathered. No, 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 no. They gathered, and that's what made them the all-stars. It was the coming together that made them the all-stars because of that space of betweenness and intersecting maps that actually afforded absolute genius. It's not that they were they were very capable, but to become the best in the world, that came out of the coming together. You got to get the order correct. It's really important. And that's social networks, et cetera, so forth. But so we're in an age basically where, for me, there have been glimmers and glimpses in history of thought at its finest that have basically been dismissed as, well, they were just geniuses. They were just geniuses. No, 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 no. That was a condition that afforded genius, that made them genius. But we've kind of othered the fullness of thought throughout history as basically anomalies, right? And that's what I'm kind of getting at when I say that thought has not begun. We have not owned the fullness of thought as itself. But anyway, you made the very critical idea of finishing a map precisely to not identify it. And there's something very important that occurs in that moment. I completely agree. This is also why we don't need to convert people out of maps. What we need them to do is to freaking own the map. Finish their map.
Yeah.
We need them to finish their map. And because here's the funny thing that occurs. The moment you finish a map, the moment you have finished it is actually the moment when you can realize it's not the territory. It is precisely the moment of its greatest success that necessitates it is just a map. Until you finish it, maybe this one's different. Maybe the map, but because here's the issue. Another way maps are necessarily closed. Reality is necessarily open. Therefore, a map, in its completeness, avails it is not reality. And that is when you feel the map is not the territory. The problem is if I say to you the map is not the territory, you go, of course. That doesn't matter. I need you to feel it. I need you to experience it. The only way a person does that is to really go all in on their Christianity, their capitalism, go all in, and to be genuine and to complete that map. And the girdle point emerges precisely at the completion of the map. That is
Mm,
because the Gödel point is correspondence does not equal coherence. Kurt Gödel, incompleteness, right?
yeah.
The key to incompleteness means that no set can entail it cannot entail its own self-reference. That would make it axiomatic, right? So, well, that's what ends up happening when you finish a map. You realize that its self-reference cannot entail a necessity of being the territory, right? And so that occurs precisely when you finish the set, right? Like that occurs precisely when you finish the map. So what every single person's Gödel point is basically the point at which they complete their map, or they realize the internal consistency is done, which unveils it's incomplete. But it's a kind of
Right.
incompleteness with the in parentheses. It's incomplete because it is complete. It's both at the same time. And that very bothness, that instability, here's the key. It is not pure deconstruction, but it is also not pure totality. Because totality gives you totalitarianism and all the problems of fascism, but deconstruction gives you, anarchy and bad stuff too, right? It gives you nihilism,
Yeah.
right? So you need a certain almost Schrodinger's cat thing. You need a kind of instability where it is incomplete with the in parentheses, because that is enough to give you direction and intelligibility, but not so much intelligibility that you can close off from the other, right? So
Mm,
you're in a kind of aporia, but it is a confusion that is not aimlessness. And it's
right.
almost not. It's a no, having direction but not being lost. Not knowing where you, let me put it, not knowing where you're going, but not being lost. We could almost say I guess Han will talk about the country path, right? Like on a country path,
Mm,
what is a wanderer? A wanderer doesn't know where they're going, but they're not lost. That to me is basically the proper mode of
mm,
relating to thinking, where you're not know where you're going, but you're also not lost. The only way to get that sweet spot is at a complete map. When the map becomes internally consistent, which required thousands of years for history to get here. So it wasn't a mistake. It
yeah.
only because it is very difficult out of the thousands of notions to determine which are internally consistent and then to realize the fullness of their internal consistency, right? Well, here we are. And if we take this all seriously, the name of the game is to make people better at finishing their maps, making them encounter their Gödel point, thus changing their relation to thought as being the activity of a country path, not knowing where you're going, but not being lost, and then having the emotional, mental stamina, character, etc., so forth, to be able to handle that sort
Right.
of process. And then I'll give it back to you. If the Christian's on a country path, if the atheist is on a country path, if the communist is on a country path, if everyone's well, then that's a universal. Everyone is on a country path, but every country path is also different, right? And that relating from the country path per se, from the Gödel point, is a universal singularity. But then, of course, here is the issue. What are the skills that that space requires? What are the capacities that that mode of being requires? Because if I were to ask, okay, so what are the capacities necessary for being a Christian, for example? Well, you say laying down your life, forgiveness, thinking the least will be fair. There are certain orientations, right? So for being a Catholic, you could go on. Every single map entails certain orientations. Well, what are the orientations of a Christian in a Gödel point? Because critically, you can't make the Christian abandon Christianity.
Right.
You have to have them bring it into the Gödel point. So whatever their orientations are going to go through a certain alchemy, if you will, a certain transformation. They are going to be different, but they are also going to be similar, right? So what are those? What do they look like? Are they universal? Is it a transformation of all the qualities the Christian has, or is it an addition of an extra three to what they have? And say the Muslim, the Hindu, the Christian, they have a set of 10 unique to their map, and then every single one of them adds three more capacities that are the same regardless every single map. Maybe it's that, maybe it's not, maybe it's something different. But it must be capacities that maintain the Gödel point, that maintain that mode of orientation of the between space. Um,
Mm,
that is, I think, basically what it means is we need something like, and I'll give it to you. We need something like lack, no thingness, an apathetic thinking based on encounter itself. Not a stable state, but the facing of the other, the encounter of the other. Because, the other issue that can occur, like there absolutely Eastern metaphysics is more in the direction of no thingness, but we also see Eastern societies can often be more similar, hegemonic. They all have the same ethnicity. They can be Japan became isolationist after Christian missionaries came in, and Matthew Stanley writes very well on that. Korea, etc., so forth. Like you can also see a problem with no thingness can also be there's no incentive to deal with difference, right? Because they say because there's no thingness, so it's same or different, it doesn't matter either way. And it's simply just existentially easier to be more similar, right? So technology allows ways to handle encounters with difference that is mediated by the third of technology or money, which can kind of lessen the extremity of difference. But then, of course, then that can train you into habits where you're unable to handle difference, right? So both Western and Eastern thought basically have brought us to a historic moment of this age of maps that begs the question of what would it mean to think these things together in a manner that's not a fake synthesis. And to me, and then I'll give it to you, although I said that 5 times, so it's funny how that worked.
Yeah.
You were already pointing to major points of this. The feeling, what you feel. You can't really debate what you feel. If I think I'm feeling anxious right now, what's there to debate, right? Greg Denver in his book on metamodernism, which he deals with the form of metamodernism that's on the side of art. Greg Denver is great.
Yeah.
But he emphasizes that art today, it's like, well, if we don't know what ideology is true, at the very least, we know I felt something. Can't really debate that I felt something.
Right.
This is getting at it. Because the moment you enter something debatable, you're in the logic of maps. And that's probably not the way, right? You need to focus on things that are not debatable. Okay, but if they're not debatable, isn't that totalitarianism, right? They're not debatable, but they're interpretable. That is starting to get you, like, what does it mean that you felt this? What does it mean that this non-debatable thing occurred? Well, that's beautiful because now we're dealing with the balance between relativism and totality because you need a sweet spot between both of those, right? You need something solid, but you also need it to be open at the same time, right? Well, something like feelings, which you can't debate, you felt this way, that is open to interpretation is getting at a certain bothness there, right? If I say, look, like Guy Senstock was mentioning this when I was speaking with him and Seth, it's the idea that if I'm in a family and you have like a drama situation and you say, when you walked into the kitchen, I felt anxious. There's not really anything to debate. I'm just telling you what I experienced, right? Now, why I feel that way, what it means, what we need to do as a family, well, that opens all of that up, right? But locating, I do think this is a big part for the Gödel point. Locating non-debatable experiences that invite interpretation, and the conversation is based on the process of that interpretation, which you might call circling or dialogue, it depends on how it is done, the net, etc., so forth. I think that is getting at it. It is getting like these not, but of course, we take what's another non-debatable thing? Water, running, resources, housing. I actually think a lot of the best philosophy is bound by, well, like, look, counter-enlightenment, Scottish enlightenment. What is a lot of that? Economics. Adam Smith, I think like philosophy that came out of these concrete concerns, Foucault actually ends up being a lot better because it is based on something non-debatable that the thing that's non-debatable though has to be interpreted. So that's the sweet spot between the two. So I'll give it back to you, but thinking the things that are non-debatable, that are open to interpretation, that seems to be getting at what the Gödel point needs to take seriously. Now, what exactly those things are, because you could say, well, we don't have to worry about a lack of water because of abundance and God will provide. So you would argue it's not. Maybe that is a non-debatable debate. Well, you can't debate that water matters. Like, water matters. Now, if it's a concern or not, people might debate, but the existence of water is matter. Because even if you say God will provide the water, you are saying that water is needed because God needs to provide it, right? So there is a non-debatable there. It is locating that and then interpreting what that means. That feelings, natural resources, and I do think there are others. That's starting to get at things. But I will pause because as you were mentioning limited water, I'm now thinking lantern bugs because the lantern beetles that are appearing in Virginia are a major problem, and you can't just pretend like they don't exist. They killed all my garden. I had some tomatoes. They're the worst things ever
Hmm.
coming down from Pennsylvania. But let me pause and give it to you, Christian.
Yeah, forces of nature are, are I was trying to research the Samkhya tradition and the three afflictions, which they posit are the internal afflictions, external afflictions, and then the kind of cosmic afflictions. And I was trying to understand better what was meant by cosmic afflictions. And you get various modern interpretations where some people say it's something to do with fate. Other people say it's, the laws of nature or, natural disasters. But I'm like, well, and then you have to figure out where you want to divide that line between something that's just external or something that's cosmic. I think I wouldn't anyways, I have my thoughts on that. But yeah, always there's always multiple dimensions to anything that we're talking about, and that's I think to me this is what at least where I'm heading in trying to identify. Here's one way to put it: what are the conditions for which by which a map can be deemed complete?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting problem to solve, and I have some thoughts there.
Yes.
Uh, one thing to use your Gödel point language, I think like for Christianity, I've always posited that one of the Gödel points, or perhaps a Gödel point, is the blank space between the Old and the New Testament.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's like that wordless space between the old and the new is one of the most important things in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what that does to me, and I'll tell you like a little metaphor I have, which kind of colors my thinking about where Christianity might could go. And in some cases, I think it does go this way, but it's not necessarily like very popularized. But I use this metaphor of like parents and children. So the Old Testament was like when you have a kind of morality that's based on because I said so, right? When you have a little kid, you can't explain the complexities of the world to their small developing brains to fully justify why you might set a rule like don't cross the street or this or that. It's just because I said so. And that's a certain kind of important authority. Um, I think when you get into the New Testament, it's kind of like children who are moving into adolescence,
Mhm.
and you're starting to give them more like principles, like love God and love your neighbor,
Yeah.
and everything else comes out of this. You're giving them again these principles that they can then apply to situations in a bespoke way, right? And they're kind of navigational guides. But again, you're still that came from an authority figure. And then I would say the next thing is adulthood.
Mhm.
And now, at some point, you no longer take your mom or dad as ultimate authorities, and that this is a I think it's obviously going to be controversial to posit this because you would start to ask questions like, "Oh, God's no longer the supreme, whatever, blah 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 blah." And I'd say, no, it's not that. It's much more like a Thomas Merton type of
Yeah.
thing where you have to take on the terrible responsibility of seeing your own authority. Yeah, that's tough. That's
Hmm.
hard. Just like becoming an adult is hard. Just for a lot of people, it's and a lot of people, I think they never fully become adults because there's and they might just replace the authority figure somewhere else, like onto an ideology, onto an institution, onto political party, whatever, um, or they give it to rationality, for instance, or pick your totalizing commitment. So it's this third move, I think, is to you do the hard work of giving authority to yourself, but in a way that's much deeper than just the rational processes of your brain and your thinking, but something much, much more fundamental, which is not completely distinct from God. Which is to say that, and this is where we kind of close the circuit in a sense, where in the East, you get in touch with that sense of self, which is the source of bliss and goodness and love and blah, 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 blah. To that is, I think, kind of fully, in some sense, becoming a child of God, right? Or I think Thomas Merton, I think it was, who gave a good metaphor. It's like you're God's thumb, right? Except maybe that your thumb has like a little brain or something, right?
Yeah.
And on the one hand, it knows itself as distinct, but also separate. So it's not some kind of crazy trick where you think you are God in a unique way from anyone else, but you're realizing yourself as part of the totality of God and taking on the burden of that, right? If there's not a huge burden to that, you're probably not quite. It's probably a different meaning of what I'm trying to say here, right? So that's, and by the way, I'll just make a plug for Bernadette Roberts. I don't know if you've heard of Bernadette Roberts. She was a Christian nun who took the map very seriously, so to speak, and an intense contemplative practice, and eventually found a place where she felt she was in union with God. But that then turned into a apophatic state where the self fell away completely, and it was just like, right? And so I bring that example up to show that Christianity certainly has, as you put it, a girdle point at the completion of the map. And Bernadette Roberts' life and she writes about it in a memoir. It's worth reading. So there's a little bit about Christianity. I'll give a personal story. When I was 19, I just moved out of the house. And this speaks a lot to what I was just saying about my metaphor for Christianity, I suppose. But and I had a hour and 45 minutes each way to my job on the bus. And so every morning, and this was before smartphones, and I didn't have books or a Game Boy. So I had, a good 2 hours and change, or 3 hours and change every day with nothing to do but be alone with my thoughts. So, and eventually you get bored with like the normal bullshit. And anyways, my mind eventually went to my discontents with my parents. I finally felt like I had some freedom to explore those discontents. And I wanted to basically, I didn't want to like just stew in bitterness or anything like that. I wanted to create an argument that I felt would be bulletproof and convincing for my parents, that I could present to them to help them see why that was a shitty thing to do and that's wrong and blah, 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 blah. And I didn't do that every day, but a lot of my days at that point were just me on the bus trying to like understand my own feelings, basically. Like, I don't like that. Why don't I like that? Okay. And so I'm doing a kind of like axiological investigation into my own ethical intuitions. And I'm slowly building these arguments, and I'm not writing anything down. So I'm also, by the way, I think this is an important thing, is I'm building the muscle of holding abstract complexity in my mind, which is something important and worth doing. But anyways, so I'm getting closer, and I'm starting to discover things that you discover in so many traditions. I'm discovering the principle of humility. I'm like, oh shit, like it's people making assumptions that they know when they really don't know, and they're blah 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 blah. And humility and selfishness, and like just getting into the depth. And then all of a sudden, one day I hit the girdle point of this map, this specific map, which is, which was like, oh shit. If I'm taking all of these ethics seriously, I really don't have grounds to be judgmental. And that's a common, realization that people have. It just took me a lot of being, but when I hit that girdle point, boy, and then there were a few. One was the humility thing, and that was just like, oh shit, I don't know anything for certain. There goes, the conditioning
Sure.
from the education system, which says you should know the right things and here's what they are. Um, then the realization that at the end of the day, we're all just kind of seeking the same things in life. That was a psh, suddenly I feel resonation with all the strangers on my bus. I feel this deep connection with them. And then there's the forgiveness point, which is like, oh, I don't have grounds to be resentful. I have to open my heart. And that was an extremely powerful, energetic experience
Mm.
where I literally felt my chest like feel like it was opening up and love was coming through. And so I feel like that's an example of when you reach the girdle point of your map where there's this recursiveness to it that you stop, like
Yeah,
I don't know anything for sure. So my maps, my system of ethical judgment itself, I can't
yeah,
take
yeah,
that as some final grounding. Um, and so, but that doesn't mean that I've got no more girdle points to find
right.
because I'm still building new
Yeah,
maps, right?
exactly.
So, uh, and now I'll bring in something that I've always used. I haven't thought about it in a while, but it's funny because it uses your map language here. But I call it the Google Map metaphor. But it's any GPS map,
Mm.
um, and I say any GPS map has three essential ingredients. It's the content of the map itself. It is what I call the blue dots because it's a blue dot on Google Maps, but it's your triangulated position in the map. It's like I am here, and it's the kind of algorithmic wayfinding process that helps you get to there. You need those three things. You need the map, you need your position, you need directions. And in some sense, I would say that for me, these are the three ingredients you need for a map to be. I don't know
Mm.
if complete's the right word because you can always modify it, but
Sure.
like it's a certain kind of completeness
Yes.
is these three things, and that's no small uh, feat.
No.
I think And I think what it calls us to do is to not get stuck in one of those three domains, which is what
Hmm.
often happens.
Yes.
It's, do I know everything? Is my map like, representationally complete? Is the wayfinding figured out such that I know how to navigate around life? Or do I
Yes.
am I in
I don't
touch with
know. Yeah.
myself?
Yep.
Do I know who I am
Yes.
really in relation to this situation I find
Yes.
myself in? So I think so that maybe I'm extending the metaphor a little bit, but that idea of like a GPS map for me is how I think of it, um, and I'll use that to jump off into something which is a little bit more of like the creative thing that I'm working on is the notion of triadic categories, and that's something that
Mm.
you and I are both familiar with from different domains, but um, I've always had a natural inclination towards triadics. The first kind of deep philosophy on ethics that I did when I was in my 20s, I naturally arrived at triads.
Hmm.
And I just and I remember the first time it happened, I was just like, but there's a third thing. It's because if you only have two, then this is. And I was like, oh yeah, there has to be a third thing. Um, and then I just started to see that a lot in different metaphysics and different systems. Like there's head, heart, gut. There's the three Dantians. There's this and Plato and blah 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 blah. Plato says wherever there's two, there must be a third. And I have like a little bit of a formalized, simple, everyday man's theory for why there must always be a third. I won't get into that now. I'll save it for the essay as a treat because I think it's fun. But the the thing I want to say is that also I'll say Charles S. Pierce also was a triadic thinker, and he put forward that there are certain oh, what's the word he uses monadic. I think he uses the adic suffix. Monadic, dyadic, triadic. He says there's always going to, first of all, you can create any quadratic, to make a word up, plus with just the ingredients of monadic, dyadic, and triadic. But importantly, there are certain triadic things which are not reducible to dyadic or monadic.
Right.
So three is kind of, he posits a magic number. There's some more recent research where people have tried to formalize that proof, and they, I don't think it seems, I'm not familiar enough with geometry, for instance, to understand the proof, but people take it very seriously, and some people have claimed to formalize proofs of that three as a minimum I just found something interesting in the Taoist works of Zhengzhi. He's lesser known than Lao Tzu, but he was the other major Taoist writer that was a contemporary of Lao Tzu. And he says something similar to the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching. He says, the eternal Tao begets the one, which begets the two, which begets the three, which begets the 10,000 things.
Yeah.
So it's it makes me wonder, that whether three was an arbitrary stopping point or a meaningful stopping point there. We can't say, we could only speculate, but it at least kind of conceptually rhymes with what Peirce was exploring with triads. And in itself, it also interestingly forms a triad. You've got, I would say, and this is what I'll kind of put out as something I'm working on, a little sneak preview of my essay. I think there's no final way to create a triadic understanding of, frankly, anything. There's just, like you said, more helpful ways, less helpful ways. But I think a very helpful way is to create triads of language games where you find, and I think that this can apply broadly to philosophy, and the way you might make define your categories here or your different games can vary, but I mean, if we take it seriously that philosophy is a linguistic project, the kind of most honest and fundamental thing to do once we start carving reality at the joints with words is to understand that we are creating different language systems, right? So I would say that once we, for instance, posit a kind of duality of physical world and consciousness, we have not just created what they call substance dualism. If we're honest with ourselves, we've created linguistic dualism.
Yes. We
have to have a different language for consciousness, which is qualia. And something I learned today that I didn't know is that Peirce invented the word quail. I had no idea. But anyways, we have to recognize that we're going to play a different language game for consciousness as we are for physicality. So these language games, I'm positing at best will have family resemblances, right? Where we can kind of notice a similarity between the idea of like qualia and something we would call an object, but they're not the same thing. They have different internal rules of consistency. And I think it's important, lastly, that we have at least three language games. I think when we want to carve things up, I think we shouldn't stop at two. In some sense, you have to recognize, I said this the other day, that the carve mark itself is a third, right? And we need to explore that carving, so to speak. So I'll generally, what I'm exploring right now is the triad of the phenomenal language game, which is consciousness. It is qualia. It's the intrinsic qualia of consciousness, such as the unity of experience, things that you perceive but are not physical objects per se. It's just like the realm of perception. So then we have the physical, you just call it general relativity if you'd like, space-time, gravity, causality, relationality in the physical world. That's a language game. And then the third I would posit is abstraction. And that's going to include mathematics, semiotics, and maybe some other stuff, but stuff that is in what we understand is like purely abstract language games. Now, is it purely abstract? No, otherwise we wouldn't be able to talk about it or write it down. But it is meaningfully distinct in that it has its own rules that are internal to itself, which you can't apply to other things. For instance, if you adopt a mathematical language game, 1 = 1. It is like a true identity. This one is this one. But of course, if we try to bring that language game into for instance, the language game of phenomenal consciousness, that's not true because this one has the property of being to the left of the equal
Yes.
sign. This one has property, right? And so, well, we've just bumped into an aporia there, right? And so I think it's in recognizing that we're playing different language games, that you probably need at least three language games to talk about something uh, in terms of it being necessary and sufficient, but also as kind of simple as possible and foundational as possible. Um, and those three you have to, and then what that helps you do is spend more time doing good work within those language games and recognizing when the aporias that we get so stuck in are just what we're trying to do is commit, trying to subsume one language game into another, right? Like, how does the brain create consciousness? We're already in the language game of physicality and causality and physical substance. Of course, you're going to have an aporia, and it's not solvable. Sorry, you can the best you can do is then look for the correlations and the resemblances between these families of language, right? So, and then we get to do what's the easy problem of consciousness, which is good, important work because, for instance, we need to know, we would like to have good grounds on which to say that data center is not conscious, right? But that person is, right? And so on and so forth. So, and then we're doing like the pragmatic so-called easy work, which is actually very difficult work, whereas the hard problems I think are better understood as mysteries. And I read recently, coming down here, um, the Penrose, Roger Penrose, has an idea that I hadn't. I don't think he talks about it very much, but in Road to Reality, he discusses his three-world theorem, and it's very much like what I've put forward. It's physical, mathematical. He kind of limits it not to abstraction but mathematics, and then personal consciousness. Karl Popper before him had the same thing, three worlds. For him, the abstract was more like cultural artifacts, laws, beliefs, but you can get a sense that it was abstract. And Peirce had his three, which were firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and he unpacks them in different ways. But yeah, that's where I'm heading, and then it's like, okay, if we take that as a starting point, then we get to do a lot of interesting work on addressing our natural aporias
Yes.
by finding fundamental triads,
Yes. Right.
understanding how they relate to each other.
Yes. Yes.
And I think
Yes.
that's where we'll find how a lot of maps
Yes.
correlate to each other is in these certain fundamental triadic characteristics.
Yes. Completely agree. All right. Again, very, very well put. So the point of maps is finding the Gödel point. That's why we have them. For most of history, we thought the point of maps was avoiding the Gödel point. That unveils the map is not the territory. The point is not, the point of a map is to use it to encounter and feel deeply the reality that it is not the territory. Whereas basically most of history, again, to repeat the point, has been a story of in the back of your mind knowing the map isn't the territory, but using it in such a manner that you can plausibly deny that that is the case until you're forced to, right? Because until a map is complete, maybe it will actually practically be the territory. Because this is important. The technical practical distinction is important here, and I should elaborate on this. Everyone knows that maps technically are not the territory. And since they know that technically, they think they know that. But the high majority of people practically live as if the map is not is the territory. And that is the problem. In fact, the practical technical distinction is ideologically advantageous to your map because you can, in your map, entail the idea that it is not the territory to mean that you do encounter the Gödel point and you know everything we're talking about because you know technically it is not the territory. The key move that Hegel makes, I would claim, is most people say the technical is the reality and the practical is the not. No. The practical is the reality and the technical isn't, actually. We believe what's technically true is more true than what's practically true. No. What is
Mm.
practically true is more true than what's technically true. And another reason for this is because the practical is a triadic, where the technical ends up being merely algebraic. Now, I'd have to elaborate that. But we know the map is complete paradoxically precisely when the girdle point arises. Because you asked this question of when do we know a map is complete? Precisely if the girdle point arises. That is the weird thing. The completion of a map is precisely evident by the realization that it is incomplete with the IN in
But in
parentheses.
a deep
A
sense of
deep
realization.
sense, a
Yeah.
deep practical sense. Because when I say the technical practical distinction, practical means you practice it, you feel it, it is encountered. The map is complete precisely when you have that moment, right? Which is very odd because that means the moment the map is complete is precisely when you realize it's not complete. It's not correspondent. Look, let me put it this way. It's complete, but it's not correspondent. So it's coherent. The distinction I make is coherent and correspondent. So completion is when it's internally consistent. That means it is coherent. The entire map is coherent. There are no essential contradictions. There is nothing in the map that in one veil, it is just a mere notion, right? So the moment of realizing the map is complete is when you finish its coherence, when it all ties. But that is precisely the moment when you go, it doesn't correspond. It doesn't correspond. Like you go through all the ethical systems, you realize, wait a minute, if I put these all together, I'm being judgmental. Therefore, they don't correspond. There's a moment of where they open up, right?
Hmm.
And that opening is you're now open to that which the map doesn't correspond with, right? Because you're throwing the map aside and then boom, there's the territory. And it's this radical experience where you actually feel the territory. Not just know there's a territory distinct from your map, but you freaking feel it. And this starts getting at the wordlessness, the ineffable, the mystical experience, all that stuff that people have been saying for a long time. You literally experience it. But here's also a critical point. People, you can taste the wordlessness per se, the mystery through psychedelics, through mystical experience, through moments of beauty. But there's actually always been a risk with these things because there's a big difference between the costly euphoria, the earned euphoria, and the cheap euphoria, the shortcut euphoria. Now, because I'm also linking here the aporia, and I always mispronounce that word, but the aporia with this space of the clearing of the mystery and the beautiful, etc., so forth. Those go together. The perplexity and the strike of beauty go together in
Yes.
mysterious
Yeah.
ways. Um, if you get that experience through any other means than completing your map, you run a risk
Mm.
of not integrating the experience fully in your body, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the problem. That can be a risk with psych. Now, it's very evident that some people are using psychedelics for healing from trauma. It can have some benefits, but all good things have risks. Like there's a lot of religious, like they're saying we don't need, spiritual, but not religious. Let's get rid of the dogmas and just emphasize the mystical. There are real risks with that because, well, the simplest way to put it is we said earlier that maps and all of that are tied to Western metaphysics that give you technology, that give you logistics, that give you society, right? When you costly earn your aporia, you are participating in the society, you're maintaining intelligibility, you're not abandoning the map. You're not saying maps are all ash and stupid. You're saying, wow, in their very intelligibility, they eventually have a certain aporia that opens, right? This is extremely necessary to not do what many people can do when they have mystical experiences, which is leave society behind, which is basically give up on interactions, the social, the symbolic, and the canon, etc., so forth. Basically, the very weird address we need for our moment is people who have had the mystical, had the aporia, had the beautiful in the social, through the social, with the social, through the completion of a map,
Mm.
not outside the social or abandoning it. This is only possible by completing maps. You could absolutely engage in mystical practices and have a taste of the wordlessness without doing maps. And maybe you could argue that that is necessary for people to do to get the strength to do the work of completing a map, right? So I don't want to say it has no role, but there's always a danger with these things because if you taste the end of the work of map making, before you finish making the map, there's always the feeling of what's the point? What's the point?
Mm.
Well, the point is you need to do the work to continue to socialize with other people who haven't finished it. Like if you don't understand their maps and you give up on the work of intelligibility and map making, that is going to threaten the social order, right? But this is where, for me, when I talk in Belonging again about a address of global pluralism, we also make distinctions that there are currently different forms of address. People are going in the fascist direction. They're going in the Nick Land direction. They're going in the pure mystical direction. They're going in kind of the more isolationist direction. I'll talk about cheap Deleuze that I associate with Japan. We'll talk about these different things. The key is the address that's actually going to maintain global pluralism versus abandon the project into something autonomous. That is going to look like some sort of socially embedded aporia, some socially embedded mysticism. This has never happened, in my opinion. This has never happened in history. It has never occurred. You could argue the technology and infrastructure was not there to make it possible. I actually think that, because I actually think it requires the internet. I think it requires this technology that we're using, the social coordination mechanism. I think it requires an ability to readily interact with people who are in different maps so you can do an acceleration of the map completeness. Like you need to accelerate the process by which people complete their maps. That for most of history, that took people their entire lifetime, hundreds of hours of apology. Like let's take someone. We'll just use Christianity. Let's take Thomas Aquinas. I think is a lovely example. Thomas Aquinas spends his entire life doing Christian apologetics to complete his map, and it's at the end of his life that he has the mystical experience, and it's all straw, right? You could argue most people in religions up to this moment in history has spent the entire time engaging in apologetics. Apologetics is basically finishing a map, finishing the consistency. Well, if you grant apologetics in a loose sense, there's communist apologetics, there's free market apologetics, there's name your piece. All of these are map making. There is a very real sense in which the internet allows a certain acceleration of map completeness that simply was not possible for most of history, but now it is, which means the average person can encounter the girdle point more quickly. Maybe not till 40. That's okay. You weren't supposed to study most mysticism until the 40s in ancient traditions, right? But that ability of the average person at their fingertips to have the possibility of the encounter of the girdle point has never occurred before. And basically, I see no other way for a socially embedded mysticism, a socially embedded apophatic thinking, a socially embedded encounter of that openness, other than through the completion of a map. In terms of its coherence, that is exactly the moment where you experience the girdle point open up. You have that openness, and you have that openness from within a map, not away from or independent in a social order. So if you grant me this phrase here of a social mysticism, if you will, because that's what I'm just going to call it here, if you grant it, which I would associate with lack, beauty, all that, beauty in the sense Jock and I describe it. This has never been possible. Never been possible. Certainly not to scale. Certainly not to spread. It is now possible. I see no other way to deal with the issue of global pluralism, right? Because here's another way to look at it. There have been efforts that some people associate with postmodernity, but it's older than that. Let's just like perennialism. All religions are the same. They all have different truths. People have different traditions. They're not all the same, but in the sense they have the same kind of core, right? Like Islam, religion, Christianity, there's a kind of effort of perennialism. And whatever one thinks about that, it's completely obvious that something like the perennial effort is necessary if global pluralism is not going to destroy itself. But how do you have a earned perennialism, a costly perennialism, not a cheap one? Girdle point, the encounter of the girdle point. You can't simply tell people every god, every tradition worships the same god. Well, my tradition doesn't say that. So right. You can't just pour it in from the top, right? What you have to have is people within all of their traditions encounter the completeness of their map, which opens it up and they go, oh my gosh, God is... They have to feel the apophatic character of God, which you can only do fully embedded in a tradition, fully embedded in a map, right? Likewise, you can have free market people all day say you can't have a command economy and the government can't run things. Oh, okay, well, like we can't predict the future. That's always the emphasis of the Heikian thought. Okay, well, really see it to the end, and then you feel it. Oh my gosh, we can't predict anything. So maybe the government does need to do trade agreements, right? You get that kind of boom, sort of opening of the aporia, but you have to feel it in your freaking bones. And basically, the only way to feel it in your bones is to experience it. And we have not had the infrastructure for that. We've had people make the claims of it who have identified the need of it, or we're all going to kill ourselves. People have identified the need of something like perennialism, or we're all going to kill ourselves. But you have to feel it, dang it. You have to like feel it. And also, it has to be a perennialism located in the tradition. This is very important.
Right.
You cannot you have to, according to the logic of Christianity's orthodoxy, have an opening for perennial possibilities that does not change the orthodoxy. This is a very, very important point. Like, there has to be, like, I'll make an example that I'll make from Peter Kreeft. Rather one buys it or not, it doesn't matter. It's just an example of the kind of logic. So Peter Kreeft says the following. He says, okay, yes, the only way into heaven, quote unquote, is Jesus, right? But once Jesus dies on the cross, then anyone in any religion actually can now, because Jesus has died on the cross, perhaps make it to the Father, because Jesus covers all people, right? So what is he doing there? He's maintaining a certain orthodoxy of Jesus being the only way to the Father, but suggesting that Jesus actually makes it possible for anyone of any tradition to reach the Father because of his death, right? So that is a perennial move that is at the same time trying to honor an orthodox position about Jesus. Now, whether one buys it or not, the point is that that character of thinking is precisely the kind of thing that actually would have to be afforded in every single possible map. Because Peter Kreeft's point, there's nowhere in the Bible that says that's impossible, right? Now, you could say, well, you have to call in the name of Jesus, and he has answers. You can go through the arguments, right? But the effort he's trying to do is to show a perennial possibility within the tradition without violating it, right? Most perennialists, and I'm just emphasizing perennialism because I think the logic applies more broadly, just to make it more specific. Most perennial efforts have not known the traditionals enough in their internal consistency and maps to have an earned perennialism. They've just kind of, it's been wish fulfillment more so. It's been, we want all the traditions to get along. So let's simply speak of perennialism being true because people have mystical experience. That's all well and good, but you have to go into the consistency. Otherwise, you're destroying the social order, because ultimately, this is what occurs. If you say it's all the same, then people say it doesn't matter, and they stop going to church. They stop doing the practices, and the social order atomizes, right? That's the risk. So how do you maintain it? Well, it has to be within the map. You have to do the work. But that's hard work and people haven't done it. So that's what needs to be done. But basically, finding the girdle point within works. Like for me, the girdle point in capitalism is the problem of demand. We have conflated stimulating demand with creating demand when they are different. We have no idea how to create demand in capitalism, which is a major problem, right? The girdle point in communism is basically no effort of communism has not fallen into a form of Stalinism, of central planning that doesn't give up power. Also, the working class tends to we tend to like identifying with class because it gives us an identity. We also are not able to deal with otherness. Like I can go on, like there are girdle points here that have to, and then when everyone in their tradition is speaking from their girdle point, that creates humility. That also creates a certain openness, but it doesn't create my beliefs don't matter. We've also tried to unify the world by saying beliefs don't matter. Just be friends, right? No. People's very intelligibility and idea of what it means to be a friend is dependent on their mouth. They can't give up their ideology. If they do that, and this is Zizek, if they do that, they're destroyed by the real. Life becomes unintelligible. They require the symbolic, right? So you have to do the frickin' work. And basically until this point, we couldn't do it. Now I think we can. A few more comments. This is just also important. I like what you were saying about adulthood. I have a kind of radical view where I believe the First Testament is, like you were saying, First Testament, Second Testament, law, principle, and then adulthood. I would actually say Paul is a Third Testament, and you have to engage in situational reasoning. I think actually Paul doesn't know he's writing books that are going to be included with the gospel. He just is writing letters, helping people think live with those principles of Christ in situations that Christ did not directly teach on. That's adulthood, and that's the terrible responsibility of responsibility that I think Paul is modeling, and Wright makes this point. Paul is actually, in a sense, modeling theology, like praxis theology that we are supposed to do today, and that's actually adulthood. But I think we've made a huge mistake in basically conflating Paul and Jesus and just speaking of it as the New Testament. I think
Right.
Paul is like a third testament, honestly, and it's like a different way of doing theology. It's a different logic in operation. I'd have to justify that. The other thing that you were saying on threes, um, yeah. So basically, I have a very radical view where I would say geometry is discovered while algebra is created. There is no such thing as a geometry that does not entail three. Because if you draw a line, it must have length, height, and depth, or width, right? So there has to be three
Yeah.
in order for a thing to exist, right? If we talk about, atoms or whatever, you're talking about things people have observed. So at the very least, you have atom, person, observation. And if you talk about a non-observed phenomenon, you're imagining it. You're creating that thing. So basically, I'm of the opinion that geometry is discovered, that there has never been in the history of the universe or in any possible world a moment of non-geometry. There has always been, of every possible moment of time, a geometry. There has never been non-geometry. And basically, algebra, when it works, is because it can be fitted into a geometry, or it is being imagined independent of geometry. That, a lot of that too that you were mentioning with the abstract and the triad and different things, language games, that makes me think of Alexander Bard's vector theory, where there are different vectors that come together, and you're basically, consciousness is here, biology. So I think it's subphysics, physics, chemistry, biology, mind, and maybe culture. He may have that technology, and they're different vectors. And no vector is reducible to the other. Consciousness cannot be reduced to biology because it follows different quality. It's a transcendental emergentism. Like, consciousness transcendentally emerges from biology, and once that occurs, it is not reducible to biology, right? So it's a different vector that nevertheless entails the logic of previous vectors, but is not reducible to it. I think also what you're saying about language games, tags, except that makes me think of Sol Kripke, who I like a lot. Joel is very good on him. But basically, to bring this to and then I'll give it to you. I have no idea where time goes. You're just wonderful. On this notion of three is fundamental. If this is so, then basically any community that can maintain a three is not necessarily doomed, because the three does indeed entail the conditions for the X, like 10,000, actually. One reason you can say is the moment you have three, you have a three-body problem, which is unpredictable. You have an unpredictable emergence or behavior. Well, what is unpredictable is unlimited, because it can always generate more, right? Another way to look at this is that if you have the most fundamental three seems to be two, relation, and the relation is real, right? So you have like two things and there's a relation. And you have to say the relation is real because the things are affecting one another in space and time space, right? Okay. Well, when you have that, you have two phenomena that are relating. You could say the possible worlds, I suppose, is you have the amount of ways these things can interact. They could easily generate amongst themselves a third point, right? They could imagine a third point, or they could generate a third point. Well, once you do that, you start getting power laws on possibilities that could kind of arise, right? And then everything can come from the three, including chaos, though, right? So how do you keep things? The more you can keep things to three, the smaller the probability distribution of probable worlds, and the more you can have creativity without chaos, because this is also the trick. How do you have unpredictability without having chaos? How do you have creative opening without getting chaos? The more community, well, it's by sticking as close to three as you possibly can, right? The more you can maintain a three, and whatever comes out of the three never destroys the three. Like, you could have, if you have a foundation of three, you can have 10 billion all you want, as long as whenever that collapses, it comes back to the three and it just keeps doing this.
Yes.
Right? So successful communities are going to maintain a 3 somehow, some way. If they go to 2 or 1 don't exist. That's algebra. It's imagined. And when you have something imagined, then when it comes down, that's not there. It's imagined, right? So the only thing that's concretely there has to be a 3, and whatever builds will always pop back, right? But since we are capable of imagining a 2 or 1, we can disorganize our way in a manner where the community could go through, well, it could fall apart. Now, because energy, you could say nothing is truly destroyed. It can always come back around, of course, but we might nuke ourselves first. Or, it might be a lot of wasted time and a lot of misery, right? But basically, if we take community, basically, if we take the question of community seriously, what would its, I want to almost say, metageometrical structure need to entail so it is most anti-fragile, right? 3. It has to be a 3 principle, right?
Yeah.
And but here's the key. That 3 has to be now located between maps in the girdle point. We know how to do this in maps, right? You territory map. Like there's always you correspondent, like you can create a 3 where it always can just generate forever. And anyone who comes into it, we're good to go. Christianity can go forever. It's good. Islam, atheism, they're all good. They've got their maps. They're just going to go forever. Great. Unless that 3 is isolating from one another and you have these 3 things, that means there will just be war till the end of the ages, conflict until the end of the ages, right? So that's where the ever recreation of the 3 could be a nightmare because you just get continual conflict to continual war, right? So if we don't want that, then the 3 has to somehow be in the metax. It has to entail the points, right? Well, if it was, so it's a weird language because I've been saying between maps, but the betweenness of maps have to be located in maps at the girdle point. It's not a between as in map ends map and it's between. It's every map in its separation entails a girdle point that creates a kind of meta between space, to throw meta in front of words because that's always fun, by which people can relate because they have something in common. This, if it was links between maps, that wouldn't be 3, that would be 60,000, and that would, that wouldn't work, right? So it has to be a 3 that makes maps relate that is in maps, which is a very odd geometry because it's an external in the internal. It is a characteristic of the externality of the structure based on the internal, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a Mobius loop,
It's a Mobius.
kind of.
Yeah, that's why I like these. I like Cadell that, emphasizing on this kind of Mobius structure that's going on. It's like a quote unquote country path. It never ends, but you're not lost. The Mobius strip, the Han, and it's kind of based on Heidegger, country path, the clearing, these things are all getting at it, right? So, also, it would be another subject. A reason why intrinsic motivation and drive is critical is because when you get to the girdle point, if your motivation requires something external from you, it requires a map. And this is precisely not a map, so you have to be your own self-turning wheel. Otherwise, you can't do the girdle point. You can't stay in the girdle point. Also, a Mobius strip requires what? Infinite motion, right? So you have to have intrinsic motivation. And then the unity between people is the motion. It is the movement. It's that we're intrinsically motivated and that becomes a commonality and that we become the geometry in our action, in our unfolding, in the ever relating with this thing that continues to develop, right? The reason why it would seem as if the girdle point has a certain 3 to it, is precisely because it's going to be you, the girdle point, and the opening. Like what is opened up by the girdle point. And what is opened up by the girdle point is that aporia, that costly aporia and apathetic that everyone else is open to as well. So the third becomes something universal that's in the singularity, but also what's funny is this third is open. The third is that which you can't bring into the consistency to thus make it AA incapsulable. So it's a open third, basically, if you will. I see no other metageometrical structure that can deal with global pluralism than an open third. The third has to be open. because if it is not open, it is closed and therefore internally consistent. But if the openness is not a third, if it's everything, it's nothing, right? There's nothing. So you have to have it, the openness has to be the third, and the third is also the quality of the relating. It is the kind of relating afforded to a being that comes into the girdle point. When you come into the girdle point, it changes how you relate, right? Because you open, you're humble, you realize I don't know everything. So it changes your relationality. So if we said the fundamental three is 2 points relation, the girdle point is the quality of, becomes the quality of the relation between you and what's the second now? Other people. It's like the second is through the girdle point per se, if you want to bring that, right?
Sure,
Which is
sure.
other people. So what that becomes the most fundamental geometry of which can deal with the issue of global pluralism that is anti-fragile. Because another way to look at it, anything compound is basically going to fall apart in any possible world. And what I mean by that is if it's not three, because three is the smallest of all possible geometry, like three, you can imagine a geometry of one or two, but they're not possible. They're not possible. Like a point is not possible. A pure point with nothing else is not possible. A line without any width, without any depth, doesn't exist. The smallest possible geometry is a three. And it is the smallest possible geometry of which can exist in all possible worlds. Like in all possible worlds, there must be, at the very least, a three, right? The key, I think, is bringing I think modal logic and geometry have to come together. I really do think Leibniz is like the super genius that, and he was just kind of overlooked. Kurt Gödel said the same thing. I kind of agree. I think people overlook, it would be another subject. I think the monads and stuff that he describes, he's getting at a lot. Anyway, when Leibniz talks about the best of all possible worlds, he's basically inventing modal logic. And by the best of all possible worlds, he does not mean multi-dimensions. He means possible unfolding of this world, right? And basically, to think, the way you can actually arrive at fundamentals is to think in terms of all possible worlds. Like if you think of fundamentals in terms of this world, well then it could just be a contingency and you're going to have a transcendental grounding, right? But if instead you say what must exist in all possible worlds, three, okay?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that would mean any communal structure that is triadic could, not necessarily, but could survive any possible future because it has the structure to rebound, if you will, right?
Importantly, because it has the capacity to encounter other communities without necessarily devolving into isolationism or combat.
There you go. That's exactly right. So only a kind of being that could handle otherness is the kind of being that could, in all possible worlds, in all possible encounters, in all possible configurations of however things may go, could maintain the most fundamental geometry of three. Therefore, the best of all possible beings, not in a sense of better, but in sustainable across possible worlds, is a being of whom could handle all possible encounters, with any person of difference of whom is possible to exist. That is the address of global pluralism. That is the kind of subjectivity that is necessary for global pluralism to be addressed. It is the kind of subject that can maintain relationality regardless otherness. Well, then that maintains threeness, triadic, regardless. And if you're able to maintain the triadic regardless, then in any possible world, there can be complexity that is in chaos. Because what you want is complexity without chaos. Well, the only way to get that is to maintain a fundamental that can always emerge. And if something breaks off, it will be like limbs falling off a tree so that it's healthier, right? Like you want to have a fundamental to make sure whatever complexity, if you reach number 1,563 configuration of universe, whatever, of this universe, then anything that falls away is just shedding of branches that maybe had a historic point, maybe it had an episode where it was needed, but now it needs to shed away. You have to have the root system. The roots die, whole thing's coming off, you know? But if it's there, then the quality of all complexity that arises from that fundamental will have something isomorphic with the fundamental. It will be fractal because it is emerging out of the three. So in its very logic, whatever it is will still entail the three and therefore entail the fundamental that could keep it substantive, that could give it substantive and form regardless however the complexity unfolds, right? So here's the trick, and then I'll throw it at you. Basically, you could argue until this point in history, the problem of the necessity of the triad, if you grant me that, was basically taken care of by nature. It was basically provided by just how things went. Nature naturally created triadic structures. Well, then it emerged to mind. And now it has to be chosen. Now it has to be chosen because the mind is naturally organizes according to autonomy and choice. So it is not given. Now, we may all kill ourselves. And we're like the world, we always have to remember when we say the world ends. No, Earth ain't going anywhere unless it gets hit by us. And even if it does, Mars is over there and some other Earth, right? So maybe if we screw this up, we'll find out that mind was one of those branches of the tree that falls off because we weren't able to handle it. But the triad is going to be just fine. The triadic metageometry of being, I'll just continue on. But if we would like for mind to actually continue, then we have to choose to align with the metageometry. Also, as a really quick note, and I actually strongly agree with this, Leibniz was adamant, and I should also note the great scholar on Leibniz is Anthony Morley, who's all of my thinking on Leibniz is deeply indebted to him. But, Leibniz argued that metaphysics should not be called metaphysics. It should be called metageometry. Metageometry is actually what's going on. We call it metaphysics, and he thought that was a mistake because metaphysics is simply a library term next to the physics. And he thought that term was leading to all sorts of confusion. Whereas what you're really doing when you do metaphysics is metageometry. You're trying to understand the geometry of being. That's form, being, all of these, like modal logic. Like once you get that metaphysics is actually metageometry, and that would include all the stuff we're talking about in these fundamental structures, you go, oh, that's what it's about. Oh, I was so confused. I had no idea what metaphysics, like, what is metaphysics about? You're really confused. Like, I don't know. But when you start talking, well, metageometry is basically about modal logic and geometrical structures that all things must necessarily have in being across vectors. Oh, okay. Got it. And I mean, it's because we don't know what metaphysics is for. And one of the reasons is because we call it metaphysics instead of metageometry. Metageometry opens up a lot. And actually, to say another extremely large claim, Leibniz's dream of a universal science, which he thought was the point of thought, basically is the dream of the metageometrical. Now, what I mean by the universal science is a big claim, but it requires metageometry. Anyway, metageometry unveils the most fundamentalist three. Therefore, all structures that are going to be sustainable across all possible worlds will be fundamentally three. And the only way that we can actually, as mind, maintain three in all possible worlds is to be able to handle otherness. If we cannot, mind, by the choice of mind, by the operation of mind, will make itself a part of the complexity that falls away instead of part of it that maintains itself. And that is precisely, for me, our moment. Because that, to me, is also the choice of, and again, I'm just to add more, basically this is the choice of if AI will replace us. Because mind could generate AI, and AI will have no trouble staying triadic because there will not be any otherness. It will just make it all algebra, basically, which of course is a fantasy, but doesn't matter for AI. It will operate according to its own logic until it's destroyed by the sun, unless it makes ships that get away and becomes robot. But, the idea is basically we're at what I like to call the AI causer, bringing in Andrew Luber's book. Like, we have the choice now. This is the choice, the absolute choice. Are we going to, the final absolute choice, are we going to choose with mind to maintain the most fundamental metageometry of being able to always maintain a relation in all possible encounters, thus being sustainable in all possible worlds, or not? If not, AI replaces us and it goes on until the sun blows up or whatever. If so, then mind can continue to be part of the complexity unfolding of being. So we get to choose that. And if we can't do it, we're in trouble. And that's the global address. So that is the address of global pluralism. Global pluralism basically is forcing the question, are you going to be able to handle otherness or not? Because if not, then mind is off the picture. That's it. If so, then it could be a configuration that can continue on. I throw it back at you, Christian.
Oh, you gave me a lot of things to talk about. One point is I think this what we've been talking about can help us see why the law of the excluded middle should be, in many cases, rejected.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a funky thing, but I'll save that for another time. One concept I had as a kind of project, which I think speaks to your interests here, is what I call collaborative reality tunnels.
Hmm.
Reality tunnels coming from Robert Anton Wilson, and speaking to your map, your perspective. The I like the tunnel metaphor because
Yeah,
it is something that you feel like you're inside of, and which shapes the horizons of what you see as possible or making sense, etc.
yes.
And that we need the girdle points from your map to my map
From the tunnel.
to
Yeah.
it needs a tunnel basically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah.
and then we need people who are good at holding tunnel spaces basically, who are good because not everyone, even if you identify the girdle point, that doesn't mean you're then good at doing
Yeah,
the work of relating to someone else's map.
absolutely.
It's
Right.
difficult work. So I think we'll need to have, as a kind of specialization, stewards of collaborative reality tunnels. I call it the court holders as a
Yes.
acronym, CORT, collaborative reality tunnel. So and then we'll and I think this is actually partly why we really need a third party in American politics. We need it should not be a third party that comes with a kind of political worldview in terms of specific policy, maybe a little bit here and there in certain ways, but is more doing the work of helping to distribute the tension of what is currently called the duopoly, right? The binary left, right, etc. I think that the American government, the triadic formation of the government, the separation of powers, is extremely smart and is why America has managed to be stable and sustainable for so long. But we don't relate to the government in that way. And often it's the judiciary, which is kind of left behind.
Yep.
A lot of people don't know who a single judge is in their states, um, who wouldn't be able to name except maybe one or two Supreme Court justices.
Right.
And right now we're seeing challenges to the judiciary,
Yes,
right?
we are.
And I think we can map this in our politics has for us become a dyadic tension, and that's threatening the triadic tension, the tensegrity, to use Buckminster Fuller's terms, the tensegrity of that triadic relationship, right? The triangle is the self-stable shape, right?
Hmm.
Where a square can collapse. With
Yes.
two, you don't have a shape.
Yes.
So the triangle is like you can't if you
Yes.
have
Yes.
equal length lines,
Yes.
it is right. This left right is not good. That's just
Exactly.
chaos basically.
Yes.
Um, and so far, the government has managed to help us through that left right tension, but I think we have to develop a
Yes.
triadic partisanship
Yes.
basically. And that the role, but to avoid the problems you see in Europe, where basically that third party just becomes this weird space where left and right kind of form these little collaborative things, and then they always tend to lean one way or more or the other,
Right.
blah blah blah. In order to avoid that, the third party has to, I think, probably remain small, like not be a thing that anyone can join into. It's got to be kind of like this small, like the Navy SEALs of politics or
Hmm.
something. Um, because if you leave it too open, it's going to attract people who want to actually pull left or right, and then it gets compromised. So it needs to be small, but its role needs to be more about like the space for dialectic and synthesis and all of that. And to the extent that a third party might have specific policy objectives, it is in service of helping maintain triadic relationships, which might have to do with like voter laws. It might have to do with some certain other things as well. Because right now it's hard, for instance, to have an independent candidate win an election. Well, maybe you need ranked choice voting or something like that. Those might be some specific policy objectives of a third party, but it would not be what are called the political wedge issues per se. I think you almost have to avoid political wedge issues as a party. Individual members of a third party might lean one way or the other, but as a whole, the party can't be defined by those wedge issues, those dyadic one versus this side versus that side type of issue that a wedge creates. The I think this is something I'm developing in my essay. I've decided not to lean into it too much because it's too kind of like, speculative philosophy for my purposes in the essay, but I think I'll write about it at least somewhat, which is the idea that phenomenal consciousness is geometric.
Yeah.
I believe it seems to be a two-dimensional space of Euclidean geometry.
Yes.
It might have some relationships to Minkowski space and other conceptions of two-dimensional geometry. If you get into some of how does he call it? The holomorphic theories of, I said his name earlier, Penrose.
Penrose.
And twister theories and stuff like this. He's positing that there might be a more fundamental geometry that underlies what we understand as physics. I want to explore, and who knows how much time I'll have to explore this in a kind of deep theoretical way, but like the idea that consciousness, the field of consciousness, as some put it, or the qualia space, as integrated information theory puts it, or the dimension of consciousness, as many other theorists want to posit, is a two-dimensional space, and it operates by the laws of Minkowski space in the sense that it's a structured two-dimensional space. There's a meaningful relationship between a form and its environment, and up and down and left and right, but there's no gravity. Consciousness does not obey the rules of gravity. Mm-hmm. The color green doesn't have a mass which attracts the color red, right? It's like Minkowski space. There's no gravity, but you might be able to translate relativity and time space into a two-dimensional manifold. Mm-hmm. Now, if we were to kind of take that speculation as meaningful and then posit that consciousness is an essential part of what we might say is a triad of reality, it stands to reason that, at least from a certain perspective, everything must make sense geometrically.
Yeah.
And then you can kind of get into more formalized proofs of why that is. But I think that's a helpful entry point, is just to like reflect on the geometric nature of your conscious experience.
Yes.
Its forms, and it's got some extra special stuff like color, which is interesting. And it kind of asks us questions about, what's kind of irreducible in reality. Just like in physics, you might have kind of these irreducible mathematical concepts and particles and all that. Consciousness seems to come with these interesting properties of color and sound and mm-hmm. blah, 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 blah. And you might not be able to get under that, so to speak. I don't know how you conceptually would get kind of more fundamental than greenness. Yeah, I don't know. It seems pretty fundamental, right? Mm-hmm. It seems like a hard limit there and aporia, and a good place then to build from.
Yes.
So, and that takes me to the problem of pluralism, because there's a form of pluralism which doesn't have what you're calling girdle points, or what I'm calling like collaborative reality tunnels. And this is just a kind of more generic either subjectivism
Yeah.
or like, well, it's true for you, so I don't have any grounds upon which to
Yeah.
try to even touch it. Or you get like a kind of lame pragmatism that says, well, we just put on whichever goggles are helpful in any given situation. But, that we're still going to run into these ethical, as you put it,
Yes.
ethical problems of
Absolutely.
like, well, when I put on these goggles, these are some hard things about ethics that I can't translate and they don't survive me putting on another pair of goggles. And I have to make a decision at some point. So, which goggles am I wearing when I make that decision? I can't wear all the goggles at once, so to speak. Um, and have you read Ways of World Making?
Yes.
So I think what's his name? Goodman. Is it
Hmm.
Nelson Goodman? Something John Nelson Goodman. Anyways, Goodman he's exploring the importance of pluralism, and he calls it a radical relativism. But he deals a lot with this problem of like, okay, well, if you don't want just kind of to allow for infinite bullshit, like terrible maps, so to speak. If you want to say some maps are better or more true, what do you do there? And then he runs into another aporia of truth making,
Yeah.
right? Because you've got coherence, you've got correlation, you've got logic, you've got authority, you've got all these different heuristics you use to determine whether something is true, pragmatism, et cetera, et cetera. This to me is like an important project that I am concerning myself with, which is how do you in your map of truth making itself, how do you find the girdle point? Where is the girdle point? And this is where, for me, I come back to a notion which I think you might disagree with, or maybe if through some working, we'll see how we're like looking at the problem from different angles. Um, but I appeal here to phenomenology and sense.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to find a concise way to word this, but I call it the axiomatic axiom, which is our sense of truth at the most fundamental level um, has it consists of a something that happens within phenomenology. And this is basically symmetry, transparency, and this is a troubled term, but I just changed it the other day actually. But I used to say consistency, and then I said compatibility, and then I've said, but basically what we talk about when we talk about the internal consistency of a system, that basically a truth we in order for us to want it to be true, it has to be compatible with our other truths, right? And I think you can understand all of those concepts geometrically,
Hmm.
which is really interesting, right?
Yes.
Symmetry, I can understand geometrically. Uh, the conformity, if to use that term, which I've used at times, I can understand geometrically. This shape conforms with this shape, or at least it doesn't uh, uh, offend it in some way. It doesn't, I don't have to take away from this shape in order to posit this shape. So these can be mutually compatible truths. And then there's transparency, which is like a truth that's not overlapping or omitting other parts of the geometric space, so to speak. So these are all fundamental geometric concepts that I'm not I'll probably never be enough of a cognitive scientist to like investigate these theories and how they might, correspond with how our intelligence actually develops. But I have an intuition that we have an innate sensibility for instance, symmetry,
Yes.
which forms the core of things like identity theory and correspondence theory. I can see that something is symmetrical. And then we take that to then build notions of correspondence and identity.
Yes.
This is somehow is like that symmetry. Um, so then I'll say there's that, which is kind of like the kind of fundamentals of truth making, and which you can kind of take every other theory of truth out of. But then there's the what's often like the fourth major theory of truth, which is the pragmatic theory of truth. And this, I say, is how truth corresponds to beauty and goodness.
Hmm.
And I would say that it's also a fundamental ingredient of a truth claim that it's got some relationship to both beauty and goodness. And that essentially something is a greater truth, or we give it like a higher truth value to the extent that it affords us either more beauty or more goodness or more truth,
Right.
right? So like E equals MC squared is just as true as 1 equals 1 in mathematics, but E equals MC squared is kind of a greater truth in some
Yeah.
sense, in that it affords us so much more, or that it's beautiful because it's so compact, right? And so I think if we develop literacy about how we come to our sense of beauty, truth, and goodness, and then how beauty and truth and goodness, our senses of them, all inform how we create values within our senses of beauty, truth, and goodness, we have a pretty good place to then start doing the translational tunneling work between maps, because all of our maps depend on our sense of beauty, truth, and goodness. Right.
Correct.
So if we understand kind of the theoretics, so to speak, of beauty, truth, and goodness, we can then see better how my map relates to your map, because we're starting from these core fundamentals that I think you just can't get below. And it has to do with phenomenology itself, I would say, and including sense and geometry and information, all of the stuff that happens within our phenomenal conscious experience.
Right.
So I think that's going to be the work of the social mystic, so to speak,
Yep.
is to
Uh-huh.
get really, really familiar with how beauty, truth, and goodness are understood and relate to each other.
Yes.
Um, I think to your point about completing the map and why that's so important, why you can't just kind of have an insight
Right.
about something, and that I think that's true, but also that I don't know that you would disagree here. We have to allow for very, very, very simple maps sometimes.
Yes.
Like I think
Yeah.
chop wood, carry water might
Yeah.
be a
Oh, yeah.
minimum viable map,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely.
And there's a great story in Buddhism about a fella who comes to the Buddha and is like, I'm trying to grok what you're saying here. I have some draw, some magnetism, but like everything you're saying is way over my head. I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. And the Buddha says, don't worry about it. You don't need to understand. Just go home. You'll find your liberation. And then as the story goes, he goes back home. He's sweeping the floor one day and then
Yep.
finds the girdle point.
Yep.
What's interesting there, I think, is that the way his map got completed, in some sense, I would argue, was through faith,
Absolutely.
which in the West we might call the placebo effect. But just like realizing that some things are realizable really just into the degree that we are open to them.
Absolutely.
And we can't necessarily reach and force things and have some physicalist, materialist metric that cross this finish line. Blah. No, and even for those who are more, their maps are way more complex, and it takes a lot more work to help complete them and find the girdle point. Uh, I think they too, at some point, have to encounter faith, right?
Yes.
Because you pass through the gateless gate, right? That you disidentify with your map, and you're no longer a little thing in the map, right? So that map has become it's a gate, but it's a gateless gate because it's you've learned to pull yourself out of it. It's very tempting to go back into the map. And I think that happens all the time, where someone has a beautiful experience and then they're like immediately obsessed with the work of the kind of discrete map making of their metaphysics and blah, 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 and trying to explain their experience. And now they've gone back through the other side of the gateless gate.
Yes.
the gateless has become gated again, basically. So there's Young brought up that point. I forget how he worded it, but like unearned enlightenment or something
Yes.
like this.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's some work of integration. You have to kind of earn it in order for it to integrate there. I'll leave with a funny story that I won't really speculate beyond just telling it, and it's interesting, was a kind of more somatic girdle point experience that I had working completely legally with the Peyote Way Church of God, which is a legal religious organization in Arizona that's has government sanction to give peyote. And when I worked with peyote, I won't tell the whole story, but at one point, it's like I went on this journey, and then the end of the journey was kind of like coming back to my physical body, but in this very different way, where my sense of agency was very gone. I would say like I the I was disidentifying with the very, very subtle maps of the mind, which are not so conceptual, but which are more instinctive maps, right? And when I disidentified with those really deep maps, I felt very much like, the Samakai's witness. I just like, there's some here in some sense, but I'm not in control. I am like, it's kind of terrifying at first because you feel like you're on a roller coaster of just like everything's happening. But one thing that was really interesting in that experience was that I had the experience, and I'm not going to speculate on the metaphysical nature of what happened, but felt like I could feel the gravitational forces in stuff in my immediate vicinity, right? Like it's hard to describe. It's a very non-ordinary experience, but like the sand and the rocks and the plants in the desert where I was at, it felt like my somatic sensitivity expanded into them. And that's, I think, well, it's again very speculative, but it kind of illustrates this point of when you find the girdle point, you are finding an openness, an access point to more in some sense. My map is becoming one with some other maps that I normally don't have access to. Okay. But, who knows, maybe you could just explain all of that with neuroscience and illusion and whatever, right? Delusion, perhaps. I'm not going to speculate on it. I have no need to, but it's an interesting story.
Yeah. Absolutely fantastic. So a few things. First, basically, for most of history, it was absolutely the best strategy to simplify the map because you didn't have the internet. The name of the game is completing a map. It doesn't matter how simple or complex it is, complete it, right? And basically, you either were a lifelong monk, I'll just say Aquinas, and you complete it, or you simplify it to being present as you wash the dishes, right? Like those were the two strategies that really worked. And basically before the internet, it had to be one of those two. Lifetime or learning to be really present with a single task and really giving yourself over to it. Like, and that can be the secret of some artist, giving yourself over to something entirely, to be truly great at glassmaking, or to truly be there when you wash the dishes. This is absolutely a way to complete a map. Basically, to say something large, you have this cup and this one. This one is more complex. This is less complex. But if they're full to the brim with water, they're both 100%, right? There's more water at 100% than this one, but they're 100%. The name of the game is to get 100%. Now, if you get a taller water, there's more water in it. There's more complexity, and therefore there's more possibility. Oh, but it's also harder to make 100%. And if it spills, there's more water all over the table, right? This one is easier to make 100%, and there's less water if you spill it all over the table, but it has less possibility than this one because the water is possibility. So greater complexity affords greater potential, but it's also harder to make 100%, harder to find the girdle point. And before the internet, this was never going to work unless you spent a lifetime in a monk isolated from the society, because you also couldn't have a job and a family and everything. This, before the internet, basically required being a monk or something isolated, right? So this was a way better strategy for the average person, like you're saying in the Eastern. Buddha's like, just go home and do your thing. This was the way for the average person on planet Earth for most of history. And the West didn't do this as much. I think Martin Luther tried, but that's an entirely different structure, a conversation. But this was definitely the way. Now, here's the issue. With the internet, it is now possible for the average person to get to 100%. And also, this kind of has, you can't, if you are, let me put it this way. If you're using the internet, you're already in this bottle. You're not here anymore because you're connected with the globe. You've seen other ideas. You've already encountered complexity, right? So if you say, screw this, I'm just going to go back to the house, the thoughts are in your head, and now you're isolationist. This is what a lot of people are doing. They've encountered the internet, they use technology, it's complex, they're overwhelmed, they've lost givens like belonging, and they say, this sucks, let's do this. But this is now in a kind of bad faith because they're doing it in reaction to this, not genuinely believing in this, and they're trying to escape this. And if you can't fill this cup to the top from a spirit of escapism, this can only be filled to the top when you're fully present, like the Buddha's saying, as you're doing dishes. And if you're trying to escape something, you can't do it. Like if your motivation for being present as you freaking clean the floor is to try to avoid complexity, you're done. You'll never get the girdle point because you're in bad faith, right? So this was much more possible for the average person on planet Earth, even if few people did it, because they didn't have the internet or complexity, and they could genuinely do it and have the girdle point. Now the average person has used the internet, and they're technologically immersed, so they're like this, right? So now they have to do the work of getting to the full, because if they try to do this, it's freaking bad faith. Unless you're Amish. Unless you make true sacrifices, give up the technology, and pay a price. If you pay a price, then yes, you can do this, but you have to pay a price. If you're not going to pay the price, you're here. So now you got to get to the top. That's where we are. I basically think academics should be in the business of finding girdle points as opposed to making maps. Like if you take all this seriously, the point of colleges change, the point of reading changes, the point of thinking changes. Everyone is different. Everything is different. The whole point of academics is finding girdle points then. Like realizing the girdle point. Now, on the question of which map is better, there are better maps. The ones that are quickest is finding the girdle point, and when you find it, making you prepared for it. So the best maps are those that are most efficient at you finding the girdle point, which is the point that unveils the map is incomplete. So we tend to define better maps as those that give you higher GDP, more money, more sex, more happiness. That's a better map. No. The better map is the one that is best at making you encounter the girdle point and earning your enlightenment and making you prepared for the life that thus follows. What maps are those? We'd have to do the work to find out. But if the point of maps are girdle points, then there is a standard by which to determine what maps are better. It is those of which greater afford the encounter of the girdle point, right? In a sense, what maps are better at making people apathetic or mystics? That can be the standard by which you go, this pragmatism? No. Zizek? You go East Orthodox? You just go through each and see which one seems to be best at getting people to the girdle point and prepared for it. You do have a standard. I'm not going to say I know, but that would be the standard, which of course is paradoxical because it means you're defining the best maps by the maps of which encounter the point that forces them to acknowledge incompleteness, right? With the IN in parentheses, right? But that's also, the funny thing is that's determining better in a road of humility. It is incredibly difficult. The problem with better is pride, right? This is better, therefore everyone ought to do that, right? Well, the better maps are humbled in their mapness. Oh, and the girdle point is present in all maps. So the thing that makes this a better map isn't even unique to it. So in a sense, it's not better than other maps. It just got there quicker, which in the big scheme of things doesn't even matter because you just arrive at it. It doesn't matter unless you know how to bring other people and their maps to it. You finding the girdle point quicker really is not of any consequence unless you know how to translate to other people. So this is how you talk about better without the risk of moralizing. That's always the problem. How do we talk about better without also subjective hierarchy and all that different stuff, right? The girdle point, the freaking girdle point, which is a universal singularity. I agree. Few more things. Yes, on phenomenology. It basically is all going to come to phenomenology. Yes, to it all being geometrical. Absolutely. Because even when you talk about, like, I would say, consciousness, if I were to freeze, everything is two-dimensional, right? So it's all two-dimensional, just like you said. What makes it three-dimensional? The body. Consciousness is always, I move, I see it's three-dimensional, I touch it, I give it texture. Consciousness is mind plus body. It's not just mind, it's together. And since consciousness is always embodied, then it is the two-dimensional experience is embodied in a brain that gives it into the three as well, right? And also in the two dimensions, even there is a three because I am relating to the two dimensions, right? So you have a moving two dimension, which is what all geometry is experienced as. This is important. You can never experience a geometry other than two dimension because you can't see the back of the cup at the same time, right? So this is the key. Two dimensions, the experience of things as two dimension does not mean there is fundamentally two dimensions. Two dimensions is the only way to experience more than two dimensions. And so the problem is we are assuming that the necessary way by which we experience geometry is the fundamental truth. Two dimensions is what we experience, therefore two dimensions is most fun. No. Two dimensions is the only way to possibly experience multiple dimensions, right? So likewise, the only way to make geometry intelligible to us is algebraically. You have to bring it into algebra in order to understand it and then release it back into the geometry. Because you can
that's
only...
a third thing is the algebra.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So algebra is not bad. It's when you forget the geometry in the algebra. Likewise, two dimensions is not bad. It's when you reify the two dimensions as the whole, right?
Right.
So, but this also suggests what? The apathetic. It suggests lack. It suggests the very way we experience is always incomplete, necessarily, because what we are experiencing is that of which must be beyond our experience in order to have multi-dimensions. Because if we experience all the dimensions at once, we die. We couldn't experience. You could argue that God can experience all dimensions at once, but we can, and if we were God, there'd be more than one God, and therefore God wouldn't exist, and therefore everything ends, right? So there has to be a certain... Geometry must necessarily be reduced to be experienced. It has to be. Which then affords the possibility of assuming the reduced form is the most fundamental form, as opposed to a reduction for our sake to participate in. This is key. The reduction of geometry is so we can participate in it, so that there is a geometry. So the reduction is a dimension that creates the relation that makes the geometry. So the reduction is a feature of the geometry for its possibility, not a loss of information or something like that, right? But because you can do that, necessarily, and your mind, then you can choose to interpret that reduced form as the whole, and you're damned. That's hell locked from the inside, quote unquote. You can misunderstand the necessary second dimension of experience as fundamental. No one can stop you. Reality can't stop you, because all it can do is show itself as two-dimensional, and you're done. That's the absolute choice. We have to choose what a universe in which two dimensions was most fundamental, which can only be imagined, doesn't actually exist, but one that can be imagined, would be experientially the same as our universe, right? You have to choose which one you're in. And why would you choose one versus the other? Well, this is where philosophy thinking and stuff like this is really important. And also, actually, phenomenology is a big deal. Because phenomenology is this, where you say, I am experiencing two dimensions. What must the conditions of possibility of reality be like so that I experience two dimensions? Phenomenology is not merely experience. It is asking what reality must be like to have said experience, right? And so if I'm experiencing two dimensions, phenomenology would say, well, there's basically two options, or at least immediately. It's because things are two-dimensional, or because you necessarily must experience things as two-dimensional to make them intelligible, right? And you say, okay, I moved my hand. This is where the pragmatist had a point. G.P. Moore's like, I have a hand. I know it's there. Okay. It seems pretty three-dimensional to me. I'm moving it through space. I couldn't move it through space if it was really two-dimensional because it would be flat. Therefore, it seems as if the body tells you that is three-dimensional, even though you can only experience the two-dimensional. That's why the mind-body split is a major problem, because the body is what actually is the evidence that this experience of two-dimensional is actually three-dimensional, which if you split the mind and the body is the non-rational source to the rationality of the mind to avoid a rational impasse of Nash equilibria in your phenomenological experience, right? So the including of the body in phenomenology is how you break ties. This is my main point. When you include the body in phenomenology, which I don't think enough people do, I think Michel Planier and others do, phenomenology is how you break the rational impasses or the Birdian donkeys or the ties you encounter in experience of just your mind, right? Like when you have a tie between a world of fundamental two dimensions and experience two dimensions for a fundamental geometry that's more than two dimensions, the only way to break the tie is your body. Okay, we're in the world where geometry is more fundamental, right? So when phenomenology leaves out the body, it ends in rational impasses. It ends in internally consistent systems that it can't make a choice between, like the birdie and donkey, right?
Glorious, yeah.
Yeah, aporious. That's where AI is going to end up because it doesn't have a body. It's going to be stuck. Won't be able to tell which one it's in, gets in a rational impasse, trouble, right? If it doesn't, it's because we tell it which world it's in, which means we send it in the right direction, but according to
Yeah.
its own autonomous rationality, it can't do it. So mind-body relation. Also, I think what got ways of world make the cheap pluralism is what people like Hunter and Berger called multiculturalism. It's this kind of lame sort of difference. And the dream of neoliberalism is that difference was not deep, that it was just multicultural. Because if that was so, there would be no problem of internally consistent systems. There would be no problem of maps. There would be a single map, and we're good to go. The problem of internally consistent systems is only a problem if there's more than one map. If there's one map, you're good to go. There's no problem, right? Yeah, but difference is deep. There's many maps. Oh, frick. We did everything in our power to ignore that. As long as we could. You could say we got through the 90s just fine. You could say, honestly, 9/11 and then 2008 were the markers of difference is deep. And we're not prepared for it. Now, that would have to be elaborated on, but we're still basically having to accept that reality. I agree that triangles are the most fundamental. I agree on a third party, basically, third party in the business of encounters. I love the gateless gate. I believe, also, I would just say, and then I'll give it back to you. So basically, for me, when Jock and I talk about beauty, beauty is not just symmetry, it is the girdle point. Beauty is the mystical, it is the strike of beauty that makes you go, oh. So the issue is you could say this. The true is the realization that the map is not the territory. You go, great. That's the true. But unfortunately, it's just technical. It's not practical now. The good is the work of internal consistency, making your map complete. Finish map making is good. And the better you make your map, because there are ways to make your map bad, falsity and logic, right? So the good is internal consistency. The beautiful is when you realize the good, and at that very moment you go, oh my gosh, there's more, and the beauty strikes, right? Which then, here's the key, the moment of the beautiful makes you go, the map is not the territory. But you already knew that. This is what's very odd in the way that Jock and I talk about beauty. Beauty, in a sense, doesn't add anything. It changes the quality of what was always present. You always knew the map was not the territory, but you really didn't get it until the girdle point. And you always knew that your internal consistency was good, but you also didn't know that goodness could precisely lock you. Because here's it's something I've been thinking about a lot, that I'll just throw in here. Why in the Garden of Eden is it called the knowledge of good and evil? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is odd. Why not just the knowledge of evil, right? I think also I'm more and more wanting to say good hyphen and evil, hyphen, like as a hyphen, because most people's, the most horrible things in the world are not simply evil, but good and evil. Like, I'm a victim, so I did something good, or they're the bad guys, we got to stop them. It's not just evil, it's we're good and they're evil. It's a dynamic between the good and evil that is going on, right? Like a lot of times when people don't forgive one another, why don't they forgive one another? Because they did something evil and I'm good, right?
Yeah.
So the dynamic, the knowledge of the good and evil, when you have the knowledge of good and evil, it becomes a dynamic of good and evil. Because in the garden, they clearly had the knowledge of good because they knew God, right? And they also knew evil. Don't eat from the tree. But they didn't have the dynamic of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And so also what ends up happening, I think, when you can complete a map, you see how good actually can be in a dynamic with evil to simply create a small fascist state or to lock you out and they're the bad guys, right? You see how your very effort to do something good could actually set you up to create an insulation that keeps you out from the other, right? So it changes the meaning of good. But then the strike of beauty and the girdle point transforms what is good. What's good is now maintaining the girdle point, the reality tunnels, figuring out the skills of relating with other maps. So it's not that, and then weirdly enough, the good of your internal consistency is good because you needed that for the girdle point. It's not that everything you did was evil. It's that it was a stepping stone for a transformation or a negation, sublation, as Hegel would say, of the good and the true to be in service of the girdle point as opposed to map making. But you had to do the map making to get the girdle point, and thus the truth of the map is not the territory is why you did the work that then made you realize the map is not the territory. And the good of internal consistency is what brought you to the good of working in the girdle point, which in a sense is marked by an experience of the beautiful. Because I would also say, well, the notion of a completed map is marked by the beautiful. And the beautiful is not simply that's nice to look at. You already said it with the example you gave. The beautiful opens up the horizon of possibility. It adds possibility. It adds things that could be true. And you mentioned the sand and new echo, makes me think of Carl Hayden Smith on hyperhumanism. There's an argument in which we don't know what the human being can fully experience and do. There is so much more. We know that, dolphins have echolocation. Look at all the things we know are possible in the animal kingdom, right? So who knows what is possible? Maybe none of it. But I certainly believe that the realization of it is, if it is possible, is only afforded by the girdle point, right? It is in that girdle point that openness occurs. And beauty as such opens what is possible. And another way to look at it, without the girdle point, all that is possible is whatever your map makes possible. So there's a limit. There's a limit to possibility. Whatever your map makes possible is what is possible if there was no girdle point. Because there is a girdle point, well, nothing is necessarily impossible, beyond the obvious, right? Like, because there's a point that's open. So what is possible is not given, is not necessarily limited by your map. It will necessarily, let me put it this way. The limitation of possibility, we make a huge mistake. We think the limitation of possibility is a ceiling. The limit of possibility is the fundamental. And if it's 3, well, then there is not anything necessarily impossible that could be possible. The only things that are impossible are that which are not even possible, like a universe where points exist as opposed to geometries, right? Well, in a sense, they're not impossible, though, because they're not even possible. They don't exist. It's kind of odd to say something is impossible that doesn't exist, right? That just seems to be a technical thing, right? So the question is the following. Under what conditions is everything that is possible possible, right? Well, that's not a ceiling question. That's a fundamental question, because everything that is possible is determined by the initial conditions, by the fundamental conditions, right? 3. And 3 in global pluralism is the subjectivity that can handle any possible otherness. Okay. If those conditions are met, then there is nothing that is possible that is therefore necessary not possible. Because if you had something other than 3, there may be possibilities that are possible that you couldn't realize because you don't have the right fundamental conditions. But if you have the right fundamental conditions, then anything that is possible, and thus possible, can be realized, right? And if one of those possibilities is a world where global pluralism doesn't kill itself, well, then the best chance of the set of possibilities in which that one would be included would be the initial condition of which is always the best of all possible initial conditions in all possible worlds. And that would be 3. And that 3, in terms of mind, vector of mind, would be the subjectivity that can handle any possible otherness. So that would be the work then.
Yeah, you've given me an opportunity to say one thing. This might be an invitation for a part 2 of our discussion, because I think it's really interesting, and I feel like I've heard you talk about beauty and truth and goodness in a kind of linear or hierarchical way. And Pierce, interestingly, talks about it in a kind of hierarchical way, or at least it's a unidirectional kind of reduction, where he says our truth is based on our ethics, basically. It's like truth is defined by what we think is good. It's kind of a pragmatic theory of truth that he posits, and that our sense of goodness and pragmatism reduces to our aesthetic sensibilities. And I agree that that is a valid formation, but I also think it's not the only formation. I think that actually all 3 are in play in any instance of any one of them. I take a kind of more holarchical or hierarchical view, I suppose, of the three transcendentals there. Because I think if you want to understand the truth that's at play when we try to make our maps, correspondence and correlation, all that stuff, beauty is at play there.
Yeah.
Why are we
Yeah.
even starting with
Absolutely.
map making? I think the essentials of beauty, which I would posit, are attraction, appreciation, and awe, which I think is the one that really comes out at the girdle point, is that sense of awe and
Mhm.
surrender and just like, whoa, and you're allowing yourself to be overwhelmed, which is allowing new possibility. But I think other aspects of beauty, most importantly, attraction and appreciation, are very much at play and kind of inform truth making. And so I look at 3 points on a triangle, and I look at causality or tensions, or the kind of a mutual informing or a tensegrity that exists equally between all 3 points with each other, and
Mhm.
then all three together form this fundamental triad of our sensibilities, our values, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if you would disagree with what I've put forward. If you do, that'd be a really interesting conversation to have.
Well, so the very weird thing is that, okay, when you complete the map, the only reason you can complete the map is because there is a sense of the beautiful. But if you don't complete the map, it's as if you never had a sense of the beautiful. But if you do, it's as if you always did. What's very tricky with metageometry is understanding time, which I actually think time is more fundamental than space. This is the weird move. This is a really weird move. We're talking so much about geometry, so it would sound as if we are saying space is more primary than time. No, time is actually more primary than space, and time is metageometrical. And I'm throwing meta in front of it because the reason why I've done that is because when you say geometry, you're taking that's space, spatial understanding of geometry. Metageometrical is actually necessarily temporal because it's a moving geometry. It's an unfolding geometry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it has to be temporal, and I think Bergson and Whitehead and people like that are correct that time is more fundamental than space, and that we, in a way, don't know what time is. Time is this metageometry.
Can
It
I?
is.
I want to put forward something that is my sense of how to do this, that solve that problem. And this is interesting, and I haven't thought enough about it, but I have arrived at time being in the domain of the abstract.
Mhm.
So if we kind of do a tripartite thing here, we talk about physical space and the body and all of that, and then we have our two-dimensional, and then time, I would say, is one-dimensional,
Mm.
hence a timeline. And this is why I think in that the abstract dimension you can have something like computation, because if you're limited to one dimension, when you have the one and then you have equals and then you have the other one, that's true identity. Because in a linear singular dimension of time, you can't hold both ones at the same time, so
Right.
they truly aren't distinct from each other.
Mhm.
You've got one, you've got something in between, and then you've got another one. That is the only aspect of reality in which there is a true both difference and real identity. And so I think it's in that sense, time is equally fundamental as the two-dimensional space and the three-dimensional space, as the one-dimensional space. And in that, you can start to then make sense of interesting things like the tension that's on the other side, which is between pure mathematics and physicality, right? Is it a wave? Is it a particle? Is everything mathematics? Is it all a wave function? Blah, 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 blah. I do believe that again, I need to think about it more, but time is this one-dimensional thing that's not more fundamental than anything else, but all three, the time, the two-dimensional space, three-dimensional curved, space-time, all three of these relate to each other at the most fundamental level, because we see how math and physics and time relates to gravity. We have a hard time bridging gravity with the mechanics of the quantum physics. That seems to be an aporia, right?
Yeah.
We have the mind-body aporia, and then the one we haven't talked about in this conversation is the aporia between consciousness and the what you might call the eternal Tao. This kind of one-dimensional space that it's hard to even conceptualize of. But there does seem to be an aporia there because you can ask the question, like, who's aware of the two-dimensional space? How is it that this is possible? We use terms like appearance or experience, and if we're an idealist and we try to collapse everything into consciousness, we say stuff like, well, it's pure experience or it's just appearance. And it's like, well, what do those words mean without someone for things to appear to?
Yes.
Right. And then you have this other question of like, who is making sense of their two-dimensional space? Right. And I think there's an interesting move here where you start to see how the idea of the ultimate self or witness relates to the abstract and relates to the one-dimensional linearity of time as a further kind of reductive move where 2D gets reduced into one-dimensional, which is time, which is the progression of experience. And that's why we have a kind of an intelligence in the face of space. Otherwise, it'd just be like, if it was just appearance, we wouldn't have, who would be aware of it? How would we be making sense of it, right? You have to have, there's an aspect of who we are, which is abstracted just in the way you say we're embodied and we relate to the 3D space in this fundamental way. I think we also relate to this abstract way, which is kind of where intelligence it relies on, which is time, which is progression, which is blah, 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 blah. So that's how I would put it. I've come to the place where I think whenever you want to claim that something is most fundamental or more fundamental, you will at least find a triadic relationship at that level of fundamentalism, whatever, right? There's never going to be a collapse into a single most fundamental thing like that. Yeah.
No, I agree.
And so then it's just a question of like, well, what's the best way to play that game of fundamental triads that helps you do things like identify girdle points or find inner peace and blah, 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 blah.
Yes. So absolutely. Basically, and I think,
sorry to take you from your
No. What I would say, and I think it a lot, basically following Leibniz, and I believe it aligns with what you're saying, is that time is the unfolding of similarity. And similarity is very mysterious because how can two things be similar? So Leibniz makes a key point in his extremely important analysis of Citas, where he says, imagine you have a temple here on this side of the world that is similar to a temple on the other side of the world. To say they are similar means that you could not identify which temple you were in if you were within it. You'd have to refer to something external from it, right? That means two similar things are that which you would say are the same unless you can refer to something outside of it, a third. So basically, the only way to tell that the two temples are different is if you brought them into the same space. So you can make them relate. You could do it in your mind or you could do it in real life. That is what unveils similarity. But where is similarity located? Where do you locate similarity? In the judgment of the subject between the two.
Right.
Leibniz argues that similarity is what Plato means by form, and that reality is similarity. And of course, where is similarity? It is mysterious, and it is fundamentally tied to the observer. It is tied to participation. And if two things are not similar, then they are the same. So also too, I will say this, when like you were making the example of 1 = 1, Leibniz would say there's no such thing as an equal sign. Because if two things are equal, they're the same. So the equal sign is an invitation to a judgment. So the equal sign requires you to make it intelligible, right? And actually what you're doing is saying it's equivalent. It is like.
Within some context.
Within some context, that's correct. So here's the key. This is Leibniz's key move. All intelligibility is actually a judgment of similarity. You are saying that this, 2 + 2 is similar to 4, that the president of the United States is similar to a bad president or a good president. You're always judging similarity. Oh, and here's the other move. Similarity is analogous reasoning. So all reasoning is analogous. It is the spotting of a logical form that is repeating. An analogy is a little different than metaphor, although very similar. Analogy is when I say to you, maybe something more like she's like a cheetah. When I say that to you, and now if I say to you, she runs like a cheetah, it's a metaphor. But if I say to you, she's like a cheetah, It invites you into imagining what that means. Maybe it means she's fast. Maybe it means she's off by herself. Maybe she's an animal. There's a logic I am inviting you to consider her by that then you will compare it with your actual experience of it, right? So very similar, but an analogy is more of an invitation to a logic that you judge. Basically, Leibniz is saying is all thinking is analogy. It doesn't, and then people like Hofstadter, Sanders, etc., so forth. Okay, if all thinking is analogy and similarity, then time is basically an unfolding of this similarity. And this similarity is necessarily geometrical. And then, of course, similarity means connection, right? It means relation. Now, where is that connection located? The connection of similarity is not located in space, and yet it is the necessary precondition of intelligibility. So it is located in a certain abstraction. But this is an abstraction that must be real. It must be incredibly real because it makes reality appear in a manner that you can understand. And without it, it would be chaos. And in what sense can you say it's an illusion if without it, you couldn't tell the difference between illusion and concrete? Like if I require this to know what an illusion is, it cannot be an illusion. It is the precondition of the category of illusion, dang it. And so the question is, what does similarity mean? Okay, if time is a metageometry and I'm standing here, this is similar to over there, and it is a shape that is unfolding with time, and wherever you're located on it, it is similar to other places because it is all part of the same cup, and I am judging its relation to the other parts in similarity. So similarity, as the basis of all intelligibility, is evidence that what is most fundamental is a metageometry of which anything I judge on it is going to bring with it the possibility of similarity because all parts of the cup are similar in being part of the cup. They are distinct and yet different. I judge the way they are different and one at the same time. So time is a metageometry that is unfolding, that is evident by the fact that all intelligibility is an act of similarity. And what is time but similarity? Things are the same through time. Like, what is time but the next moment is like the previous moment? Time is a similarity. And if it moves, then the next moment is like after the motion. It is a continuation of a similarity is what is occurring. When I say Daniel is like Daniel, the Daniel you're speaking to today is like Daniel from a month ago, you're saying what? They're similar. You can't be saying they're the same. You're saying that they've maintained a certain level of consistency through time. Well, how is that possible unless time is a consistency, ergo a metageometry? So time itself must be the thing that is consistent, of which we are all participating in. I think this is basically completely possible. If you say, I'm big fans of Stuart Kauffman, he basically makes the move of saying the following. So the question right now is, how do we get quantum mechanics and general relativity to go together? You know what move he does? He does he says that non-locality is more fundamental than locality. Locality is anything that follows space-time. So anything that can receive a signal according to the speed of light. Non-locality is where a quark over here moves, one over there moves beyond the speed of light, and they're simultaneous. So it's faster than the speed of light. It's spooky quantum action. That's non-locality. He just says the following. What if non-locality is fundamental and locality is just in non-locality? It's a special case within non-locality. It actually solves a whole lot of paradoxes but what would this mean? If non-locality is most fundamental, which means instantaneous time is possible, then it's all relation. It's relation all the way down. That there is no separation. It is instantaneous. That means it at least means this. It is everything is connected. Okay? Is everything connected on this cup? Yes. Metageometry entails a way everything could be connected. But is the handle identical to the rim? No. So it's all the same and yet distinct at the same time, right? Non-locality as fundamental would invite the possibility that all of reality is in fact a metageometry that could be different and similar at the same time, which of course aligns with experience because all we ever experience is a similarity that's continuing through time. So then the phenomenological experience would match with the metaphysical proposition, the metageometrical proposition, and that alignment would be plausible because it also just frickin' seems to be how things are, dang it. And that also is how we make intelligibility occur via an analogical reasoning. And maps, in their internal consistency, can get in the way of this realization because you can view a map as a locality and the Gödel point as the non-locality. And if you're always operating within the locality, what use do you have for the non-locality? So the working toward the Gödel point, I would actually argue, is alignment better alignment of the subject with the most plausible notion of fundamental reality as a time space, which is a metageometry where non-locality is more fundamental than locality, of which we should expect if all intelligibility requires a judgment of similarity, which is fundamentally relational. So it's relational all the way down, but not in a lame way where we say in a metageometrical way. You must, when you say relations are all the way down, be speaking of geometry. Otherwise, I don't know what you're talking about. If relations are not a metageometry, then you're just saying connection? Like, what is that? Relations are a geometry. Time space is a metageometry. And so basically, to speak about the address of global pluralism, and I'll stop. And I suppose I should did I say feed the children? The kids are dying. So metageometry is basically what we were saying about the address of global pluralism, in my opinion, is actually in a very odd way, simply an alignment of the subject with reality, which classically the whole job of philosophy is to make you like things are, right? It just turns out things are different than what we thought. It turns out it's not like a stable being that we need to align with. It is a metageometry. And the other things I would simply note is on this weird way in which, in one sense, beauty is greater than true and good, in another way it's equal. The only way to make sense of this goes back to your point of the 2-dimension and the 3-dimension. I have to experience them one at a time, but every time I experience them one at a time, I experience them in a manner that suggests it's all of them. And the issue is that in the beautiful, it is a realization that it was always already the beautiful, but you had to experience it as if it was separate from the true, the good, because otherwise you would confuse it with a lower point. So the way Dante explains this is he says it's all arrows. When you fall in love with pizza, you're on the way to falling in love with God. But he has to start with pizza, and then pizza leads you to Beatrice. Beatrice, right. That leads you to art, so it's the ladder of desire that you can even get into Pseudo-Dionysus and people like that. It has to be like that. But once you get to God, you realize, wait a minute, God was actually always in the pizza too. That the love of the pizza was actually the love of God that I couldn't experience as the love of God back then because it would have overwhelmed me. It had to be a gradual process of unveiling, right? So the UN in parentheses. So it goes with beauty. It's concentric circle. You kind of have to start in truth because you have to start in facticity. Right? You got to kind of start with making sense of things.
I would ask you, because I disagree, I would ask you to make a very, very strong argument about how you would have truth as a starting point that's more fundamental than starting with goodness or beauty. Because I don't see how you make that argument.
So what I would say, starting, the key is when I say start with, it is a relative position on the geometry that is always already starting with a realization that good and beauty are always there. Like it's all part of it at the same time. You start in truth in so much as you start breathing. You start in facticity. And then there's a realization that the only way you start in truth or facticity is precisely because you have to be assessing something as relevant as something else, which requires there to have actually been good at play. And then in that goodness, that is also leading you to the place where you realize your understandings of the good could be captured by a mat and it has to be blown open by an euphoria, right? Someone else could absolutely, but here's the issue. You could define the true, you could use the word the true interchangeably with the word good, right? Like you could say it's good to breathe, right? So another way to put it is you have to start with something. And the fact you have to start with something, one could argue, say, is a truth. You have to start with a sequence. And the fact that you have to start with a sequence, it then turns out that that is good, because if you didn't have to start with something, then nothing would get going. And then as you realize that is good, it can bring you to the place where you can realize the thing that you started with does not bind you. You are not bound to it, right? So there is a way in which there is, but that beauty was actually always the point of the thing that got started. The whole reason the thing got started was actually for the realization of the girdle point. So the sequence that seemed to suggest a hierarchy was actually only a hierarchy for you that actually was only to bring you to the place where you realize there isn't a hierarchy in any way whatsoever. That it's actually, it's like the concentric circle where they're all, beauty is entailing all of them. Now, again, you could also just make the move. There's also here a language game issue. Because some people would say, well, I'm just going to call it the capital G good, or the capital T truth, or the capital B beauty. I have no problem with that. If you just want to say it's a capital X, and there's a different word I want to emphasize, so be it. The argument I would make, though,
Hmm.
is that I believe R8, because this question of the language game you use is also relative to the historic episode. Like, what moment of history are you in, right?
Hmm.
Um, what is most likely to bring people to the girdle point? There's easily a time where everyone is talking about beauty, where actually capital T truth could be the apathetic space, right? Because people arguably needed that in autonomous non-rationality before the Enlightenment, where the idea of a capital T truth was actually precisely what people needed. You could argue there was a time where people needed the capital G good, because they had no sense of the ethical and it was chaos or something like that, right? They may have had a good sense of a relation with nature and beauty, but not the capital G good, right? I would argue that our age is one that has basically thrown away beauty. Like, it is one where the notion of the beautiful is completely mysterious and people know. And certainly when I was working on in college, eunoia, the main reason we kind of did eunoia, which means beautiful thinking, loosely translated from the Greek, and like, what is a gospel compared as an artist? Because we were strongly of the opinion that beauty was completely disregarded. The church had no business with art. And there was an idea that beauty would be the signifier that would bring people to the girdle point, that would open them up, because that people felt like they had a good grasp on truth. It was the Roman road. They felt like they knew how to be
Right.
good, conservative, but they didn't have the beautiful. So the beauty became the thing to hold to. I still believe that basically beauty is the best signifier for our current moment. Because when you start talking
Hmm.
about diversity and difference and the mystical and the apathetic, I believe the experience of that is closer to all. And I believe the problem we have now is the word good, which maybe at different historical periods was fine and actually good. The word good is too easily moralism and contributing to the conflict between maps. And the word
Yes.
true is very hard to use because that's just facticity, pragmatism, and all of that other stuff, right? But absolutely, if we are talking about a certain capital G good or capital T truth, which are distinct in quality, well, then yeah, absolutely, it's interchangeable with beauty. But it has to be understood as being whatever capital letter term you want to make is the term by which you are signifying the altogether-ness of all three, right? So let me put it this way. Lowercase t truth, capital G, lowercase g good, and lowercase b beauty, they are not interchangeable. They're actually different, right? But capital T truth, capital G good, and capital B beauty are equivalent. They are the same.
Hmm.
But the way the geometry, but here's the issue. All three of those actually they are the metageometry. They
Right.
are the metageometry. They are the one and the many. They are this. If this is time space, when you're talking capital G good or capital B beauty or capital T truth, you're talking about this, right? And at different history, let's say the handle is truth, let's say the bottom is good, and let's say this is beauty, okay? And we're talking the capital B. Okay. We're in a historic, let's say 500 years ago, you were in a historic period where this, the truth, was what people could access because of the arrangement of lowercase b. Now I'm talking lowercase beautiful, lowercase true, lowercase good, was such as the historic moment that the part of the metageometry people would possibly relate to as the girdle point was the true. So the handle was facing. Okay? That's where people access. I think I said the bottom was good. But then 300 years went by, and this became stale. The language game was stale, it didn't connect people, and it was captured by institutions. Well, now it's the good. And what you have is, because of the arrangement of the lowercase variables, the way people access the girdle point in the metageometry or have a higher probability of encountering is the capital G good. And that was the signifier that people needed. Okay? Well, now I believe we're here, which is beauty, and that is the signifier. Because of the arrangement of the lowercase, that is what people need in order to have a chance to get to the metageometry. But if you get to the metageometry, well, you get the handle and you get the bottom and you get that too. So you get the capital G good and you get the,
Yeah.
you get the lowercase, the capital G good and that capital and this. And the lowercase ones, of which are distinct, we're all for the sake of getting here, that if you get here, you get this. You get the metageometry. And the metageometry, you could ultimately, if you just wanted to say capital X, like an X variable, apathetic, God, obviously that's what people mean. That's what you're talking about when you talk about, and also critically, when you get here, the true, good, and the beautiful are actually more like the true slash good slash beautiful. It's not true and good and beautiful. It's actually all slashes between them. They're all the same. Down here, I want to say, which is weird because down here is actually here as well. That's the weird freaking thing is you actually, the lowercase letters are on the cup, but they are having to get you to the top. So let me restart that and say it a different way. You're here, okay, on the metageometry. Here is where you experience lowercase b beautiful, lowercase g good, and lowercase t true, right? You are in an age where the arrangement of those makes it very difficult to get here or here. But you could get here, right? So you follow the good, the true, and the beautiful in lowercase terms to get here, which is the capital T truth. Now I know I'm on this. Now I know I'm on a G, because once you get here, you go, wait a minute, it's not flat. There's higher dimensionality, vertical, handle. Oh my goodness. Wow, so I'm here. So then you get this, but then you go through a period where people forget the handle. It collapses back into this surface, and now you're going along with your lowercase b, lowercase g, lowercase t. But this particular historic age is when the capital G good is there, and you follow the lowercase, and you get here and go, oh my gosh, there's a different dimension. I thought it was flat. Turns out it has depth. Oh my gosh, there's a metageometry. It's 3D, not 2D. And you do that, but then time goes on, and this collapses back to the flat place, and this is 2010 or something. And you've got your beauty, your good, and your true, all lowercase. This is not there for you because it's been captured by the institutions. This is not there for you because World War II has traumatized people to ideas of the good and ideology. So you're here.
You keep trying to fill your cup up, and it just
doesn't have it. It just slides off the side. Yeah. So you're here, and you follow the lowercase words, and eventually you go, oh my gosh, this is beauty, capital B beauty. Oh my gosh, we're in a geometry. It's three-dimensional. It doesn't matter how you get to it. All capital letters unveil 3 dimensions instead of 2. If you're stuck on this, you think there's 2-dimensional, because even if you're going along, you're not going to feel the curve. It's like the curve of the earth, right? It's going to feel flat to you until you go, oh my freaking, now it's 3 dimensions.
Right.
Or you go, oh my gosh. So whatever signifier one needs, so be it. The key, as Jockin and I stress, is not to collapse them into the flatness. And that's what has kind of occurred. Is they've collapsed. And when you collapse them, you're stuck. You're damned. You can't get off this. But when you say, no, they're distinct, once they're distinct, the good, the true, and the beautiful, then you can follow them, you can order them in a manner that makes possible the vertical relative to the conditions of possibility afforded by your historic moment, right? And so that is how I would describe it. It's kind of like, again, when Christians talk about the Trinity, which makes absolutely no sense unless it's a geometry. If it's a geometry, it's no problem. 3 and 1, no problem. That's everything. Algebra is a contradiction. As a geometry, no problem. It's the same thing. The 3 infinites are a trinity. It's 3, 1 essence. It's the 3, 1. It's just that. It's just a metageometry. So that is how I would approach things.
I appreciate that, and I think it, for me, clarifies where we're probably on the same page, and your context about the relevancy to our current historical moment, I think, is really that's what was the aporia in our conversation, or our disagreement there. And the thing I'll say to that is that I think it's the reason why it's, well, I'll push back a little bit in that I don't think the capital T, good, truth, and beautiful are interchangeable, even at the capital T level. I do think, this is my language game, they collapse into love fundamentally, which of course you then have to ask, well, what's the love of fundamental triple love? But I do think that beauty, truth, and goodness are all, they're like the spectrum, the spectrum colors of love in some sense. We love truth, we love beauty, we love goodness. Well, they're expressions of love. And go ahead.
No, well, not to jump in. What I would say is that the capital T, it would expand into the others. Like, because the handle unveils there's more shape, there's more metageometry. So I suppose what I would say, not to be nitpicky on the language, not like when you said
that's part of the fun of philosophy.
That's fun, is it? That the capital T truth collapses into the capital B beauty and different things. What I would say in the capital letter, so in the lowercase realm, they collapse because they head toward geometry. That's the problem. In the upper level, they, in a sense, expand into the same design. because the handle expands. Once you experience the handle, the very structure of it, it has to be more. The fact it has to be more. Once you encounter the handle, you can expand the handle into, well, there must also be beauty here. There must be a circle. There also must be a bottom. And you can then say, well, then there's something that's beyond just those signifiers, like God. And of course, what is the other name for God? Love, right? So you can do,
Right.
absolutely, you can argue that those three expand into a
Collapse might have
geometry.
not been the right word. I would also quibble with expansion, but that they are. I don't to just put it
They
without.
relatively expand to your scope. They don't actually move
They
in
are
that.
aspects of the
Yes.
love. The
Yes.
fundamental aspects of love is how I
Yes.
might put it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then if we kind of take that, I think what we might see as our work is then to find different country paths that are going to be most helpful to
Yes.
different people. And I think
Yes.
there's going to be a huge diversity. In some
Yes.
sense, it's going to be a little different for every single person. And I see what you're saying. I think, especially for philosophical people, why you would start with truth and then goodness and then get to beauty being this more pronounced experience when you reach the Gödel point.
Yes.
But I think that there's other paths,
Sure.
so to speak.
Sure.
And you might start with beauty, then go to goodness, and then for you, the girdle point feels like a revelation of truth, where it's like, oh shit, now I understand something that I didn't understand before. But it's the same fundamental experience in that you're reaching the girdle point. It's just there might be a different one aspect of love in that situation might be more pronounced than the others, especially because you might have had less access to it beforehand, right? Like if you're a very stodgy, rhetorical person and you're just somehow you got caught in the spiritual quest and you're reading all of the philosophy books and then you have this big opening moment, what might be most pronounced is the beauty. And I've met people who've had that experience and they're like, it's like for the first time I was able to appreciate the color of the sky and all of this, right? But for another person, it might be this feeling that like, oh shit, things that all of my mental confusion has kind of become more parsimonious and clear and simple. Now I feel like I understand things. But they might have already had a higher capacity for the beautiful, and that might have been their lead-in point was as a discovery of art, right? And you get really into your art, just like you mentioned earlier. It might be the being a great chef or chopping wood and carrying water. So I think that the reason it's helpful is to keep everything kind of on equal footing is that that allows us the most different pathways to love, basically.
I don't disagree. So basically, if we're talking the lowercase, so if lowercase g good, lowercase b, and lowercase t, which are all spectival second dimensions of the third dimension of the whole, right? So it's not a hierarchy. It's a spectival invitation to the
Right.
possibility of the
A
higher.
specific perspective, yeah.
Yes, and so they can be ordered any way one likes, because another way to look at it. Instead of using the terms, you could almost say lowercase x1, lowercase x2, lowercase x3, and then capital X, right? So the only
Yeah.
fundamental requirement is that all three of those have to be at play at some point, right? All three of those have to be at play, and that is the fundamental. Now, for capital X to be experienced, right? So those have to be at play. The capital X, it is a way to look at this.
Hmm.
When people experience the capital X, it is very like, what is the knee-jerk term that they use? Like, what is the term that just comes out of them, right? Because that could be almost a kind of, it tends to be things like God. They say light, love, beauty. A lot of times we'll say beauty, right?
Sure.
So one of the reasons I suppose I emphasize beauty with this kind of mystical, because I mean it as a strike, I mean it as the mystical, is because it's the term you hear people use. It's the
Hmm.
one they kind of use when they have this experience. They don't say good. They don't say true. They tend
Well,
to describe it as good and true after. But the knee-jerk experience of it tends to be, in my experience, tends to be beauty. That then what's interesting is that they say it's more real than real. This is where they start coming together, right? So there's a kind of like knee jerk, and then they'll say it's more true than true. They love it. It's the most real thing that's ever happened to them, right? And this is where it does seem to be that you have to include them all together, right? And the issue also is the knee jerk, like what people can't help but kind of experience in that moment, this kind of opening up. To me, again, and this can just be the meta language, for me, that seems to be the strike of beauty, is how I describe it. And then for me, it feels as if people then will describe that as the truth and the good. But the knee jerk, I locate more on the beauty. So that's why I've chosen that term. But then
Got it.
also, it is not something where for me, if simply lowercase x1, lowercase x2, lowercase x3 are a fundamental relation, those open a capital X, that's the formula. And whatever signifier one needs for the historic moment or the
I see.
description, that's fine because the formula, if you will, is the same. And basically, that's the transition from algebra to geometry, right?
I get it.
So
I guess I would, for me, the strike word I would use is love, because to me that's the only word I find that captures the entirety of that
I will
moment.
definitely say I am totally cool with love more than I will. Let me put it this way. From my experience, there is more risk with capital G good and capital T truth than beauty and love. I would take
Sure,
love and beauty over those terms, even though if you're capitalizing those terms, I'm okay with them. The reason why is because I think in our
I see.
historical moment, truth and good
Yes,
have been exhausted in favor of ideology and are hard to get people
yeah,
to use. They've
and
been
they draw you, they seduce you back through the gateless gate,
That's what
right?
I'm getting.
Back.
Yes, that's what
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
saying.
yeah.
Good and
They're very
true.
seductive. I understand.
My
Yeah,
problem with truth and good as emphasis is that they're too easily now in service of map making and not the girdle point. I believe
yeah.
basically everything comes down to the girdle point. And so for me, the language that best affords that is the beautiful and
I
love.
see.
Now, that all said,
I like what we've just done here though, which is
yes,
like exactly what we're talking about. Is like my language game and your language games seem to be at an impasse. Let's take the time
yeah.
to like figure it out. And then that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Now the risk
We
of beauty though, to be very clear, the most terrible totalitarian movements in history have emphasized beauty. They've
sure.
emphasized the aesthetic. They've emphasized
It
art.
can be captured. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, it can be captured. And in that age, one has to emphasize the good or the true, right? One has to shift, right? And in an age where fascism is using beauty to talk about the beauty of whatever nationality, one must be very careful to talk about the beautiful. You may instead need to talk about love. Um, and certainly, when one is using the beautiful in the way I am describing it, it is in the mystical. Because also beauty, in the way Jock and I are describing, creates love. It always creates love because it creates eros, as Dante. You cannot experience God and not feel love. So to talk about love and beauty, eros, all of that, that's perfectly all together. And that's where that emphasis would be on. But I do want to stress, I completely agree with the idea of lowercase x, 1, 2, and 3. It has to be any possible sequence of those, or there is a close of creative possibility. And if there's a close of creative
Right.
possibility of an arrangement of the variables, that would be in violation of modal logic because you can't say it can't be this. Oh, that would be a transcendental
Right.
grounding. If you say it can't be this, it's a transcendental grounding. The only transcendentals you are allowed. So here's a key point. We talked at the very beginning on the problem of transcendental grounding. Okay. The only transcendental you are allowed is an acknowledgement of the metageometry, which in a sense is transcendental, but it's also not. It is the structure of all things that exist, right? Is that transcendental? Here's a question. Is the form of the cup transcendental, like the Plato form? Is time-space transcendental? Is time transcendental? Yes and no. Time is transcendental in the sense of your ability to entirely capture it into a dimension you can understand all at once, but it is also not transcendental in the sense that it is separate from you, right? So everything, time space, metageometry is an odd mixture of the participatory and the transcendental at the same time, right? You're in it, but you're never in the whole of it, right? So the only thing that can be transcendental and thus must be this unfolding, this metageometrical, that is in a sense conditionally transcendental, that but actually technically it's not transcendental because it's practically transcendental but not technically, because technically you're part of it, but oh, the practical is more real than the technical, so it is transcendental in that sense, right? That's a double move. That's very odd, right? So the other key is you can avoid talking about transcendental grounding while at the same time maintaining a transcendental form by talking about a metageometry that creates structure. But here's the key: the metageometry cannot violate a possibility, because the metageometry, if it violated a possibility, then there'd be a ceiling to where this could go. Well, that means there's something beyond the cup, right? So there can't be a limit to what this can unfold into that is entailed in what it is. Like anything possible must be possible, right? If you say that something possible is not possible, there must be a transcendental limit beyond the metageometry of being that would eventually hit and limit the cup, right? That can't be there. There can't be a limit beyond the cup. The only thing limiting the cup must be the cup itself. The geometry itself must be its own limit. If it is not its own limit, the limit is transcendental. That's a problem. And the limit must be moving. It must be a transcendental limit. Okay? So if you say x1, x2, x3 must be arrangement 2, 1, 3, it can't be 3, 1, 2. Well, that's out here, right? They're all on the cup, and the cup could roll anyway and move the variables, and they could hit each other in different ways. That has to be in the cup. If you say it's not in the cup, then you're saying there's something out there. So you cannot say that something is possible is not possible. If it is possible, then it is possible. Is it the case? Maybe not. That depends on the historic moment, right? But you can't close yourself off. Oh, wait a minute. You can't close yourself off. So you're saying this itself is a girdle. This itself entails a girdle point. Yes, this itself is always unfolding, and therefore it's a girdle point. Maps entail girdle points. That means maps are complete with girdle points. There's only one way to have a map that is complete and incomplete. It's moving. The map is moving itself. It is a movement. It is a structure. That's how you can have a whole thing, and the movement is outside the thing, and yet not, because the only reason it's moving is because there's a thing, right? A girdle point is a testament to time, because it means there is that which is moving the completed map, right? It is that which is giving it motion. So the girdle point is the testament of dimensionality beyond your two-dimensional map that's making it possible to unfold, right? And so the map, so time space itself is a testament to the girdle point, because it's a testament to the possibility of movement. And if you can have movement, then you have definitionally openness, because all movement requires openness. And so if you dwell in the girdle point and you're open to the other, then you have the structure of the metageometry of being in your very subjectivity. Therefore, you're isomorphic with reality. Therefore, you are a fractal of reality. And what is the entire goal of classical philosophy, basically? To have being. How do you have being? You have to be like being, similar to being, analogous with being. The only way to have substance is to be like God, in the image and likeness of God. You have to be isomorphic to it. You have to have the same structure of reality on a smaller scale that is fractally the same. It would be the same on the whatever way you look at it, right? Well, if time space is this, which is a testament to a girdle point, and you as a subject are doing the same, then you have the analogy of being, which is arguably the goal of philosophy. The goal of metageometry.
Yeah, I have to go paint a table before I have to go do other stuff. Yes, no, rest in peace. One fun little thing that's just anecdotal, so it's not necessarily a point to end on, but it's I might work this into my essay, but I think you can kind of get to where we've gotten in this conversation if you take three things, one each from Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, which is just kind of like a nice, fun, playful, philosophical game to play. But Aristotle says philosophy is carving reality at the joints, or the world at the joints, right? So you're already admitting that once you engage in philosophy, you are taking a whole and dividing it. So I think that's a pretty big clue
Yeah.
that, you know, we're decomposing something rather than actually kind of capturing it in some holistic way. Plato introduces well, I'm not going to say he introduced largely, but he posits where there's two, there must be a third. You can't have just two. There's always going to be a third.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, because once you carve at the joint, well, there's that one side of the joint, the other side of the
Yes.
joint, and the joint itself.
Yes.
And then Socrates, I know that I do not know. I think it is basically saying that, you know, once you do that, whenever you're discussing one of those thirds, there's a limit that
Yep.
you're contained, right? And so then that's why I think the what I'm thinking is the most helpful way to approach metaphysics, or some type of holistic philosophy, is you have to have your thirds. You have to realize that each of those thirds cannot be subsumed or subsume the others. They are distinct in some way, and they are limited in some way in
Yeah.
that regard. And the best way to divide is in terms of language itself,
Yes.
because once you forget that you're actually just dividing the world into separate language games, you become quickly blind to the fact that you're playing language games, right? And then you get into the support of like, well, does non-locality or locality more fundamental? And you've already forgotten. We've already forgotten that we were playing language games.
Yes.
What would it mean for one, right? And then whoa. We step back. We realize in the philosophy is language. Philosophy is dividing the world. Best to divide it into three parts and consider those all languages.
Yeah. Love it. I love that. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, carve, third, limit. Limit to three, you unfold with. And what you're unfolding, like you can't unfold, like to this point, you cannot unfold with difference if you can't work with language. The number one thing you see everywhere that is keeping people from relating is language. They can't cross language. They get stuck in their language game, and language games are maps. You get stuck in your internally consistent system, you can't get out of it. So I think that's beautifully said. Christian, I've had a great time. Thank you, sir. I've really
Wonderful conversation.
Wonderful, sir. All the
Until the
best to
next
you.
one.
Until the next one. Best to you, my friend.